There is a kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with your body. It is the tiredness of trying to figure everything out, of reviewing the day behind you, rehearsing the days ahead, of wondering if you are learning quickly enough, growing wisely enough, becoming the person you were supposed to become. That kind of tired. If you feel something like that tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we slow down together. We follow the thread of a simple truth that practitioners across Asia discovered centuries ago and quietly passed down from teacher to student, generation to generation, not in grand declarations, but in small moments, in the sound of rain on a temple roof, in a bowl of water, perfectly still, in the ordinary breath of an ordinary life, fully received. This video offers contemplative stories drawn from Buddhist wisdom traditions across many centuries and cultures. It is created for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Let it simply be a companion for the night. The teaching we explore tonight has no grand name. It is almost too simple to say, everything teaches. The river teaches. The failing teaches. The moment you stopped trying and simply sat, that teaches most of all. Across Japan, China, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, and beyond, awakened practitioners did not wait for wisdom to arrive. They found it in the kitchen, in the garden, in the face of a stranger, in the long silence between question and answer. You have gathered a great deal of wisdom in your life, too, in ways you may not yet recognize. Tonight, you do not need to acquire more. You only need to rest and let what is already here settle into the quiet of your body. Find a comfortable position now. Feel the weight of your shoulders release downward. Notice the surface beneath you, how it holds you without effort, without asking anything in return. Take one long breath in and let it go slowly. You have nowhere to arrive tonight, nothing to understand before morning. The stories ahead will come to you like water, gently, without demand. And if at any point your eyes grow heavy, let them close. If you drift, that is welcome. That is the whole point. Let the night receive you now. Let something older than worry hold you. We begin in the 9th century of the Common Era, in the northern reaches of China, where the land flattened into wide, dusty plains, and the winters arrived early and stayed long. There stood a temple called Guanyin Yuan, the courtyard of Guanyin. It had not been grand for many decades. The great suppression of Buddhism under Emperor Wuzong, barely 20 years before, had burned scriptures, expelled monks, and forced thousands of practitioners back into lay life across the empire. Many temples had been razed entirely. Guanyin Yuan had survived, not because it was important enough to be targeted, but because it was so modest that the imperial officers had passed it by on their way to larger and more conspicuous establishments. Its walls were cracked in the places where frost had worked its patient way into the mortar through many winters. The main gate hung slightly crooked on its hinges so that it never fully closed, leaving a permanent sliver of pale sky visible at the edge of the frame, whatever the hour. Cypress trees grew in the courtyard, old ones, with bark so deeply furrowed you could press your fingers into the channels and feel the centuries there. Their roots had long ago lifted the flagstones in long, slow arcs, making the ground uneven in a way that somehow felt deliberate, as though the temple itself were practicing a kind of humility, refusing to pretend to smoothness it no longer possessed. In autumn, the leaves of a single ginkgo tree in the far corner of the courtyard turned a yellow, so vivid it seemed almost to produce its own light. casting a warm, reflected glow across the stones below. In winter, the water in the barrel near the kitchen door froze by midnight and had to be broken with a wooden mallet in the mornings. In spring, swallows built their nests under the eaves of the meditation hall, and their small sounds, the rapid soft exchange of arrivals and departures, wove themselves into the silence of early morning sitting. In summer, the air smelled of dust and distant wheat, and, when the wind came from the east, of the river that ran somewhere beyond the flat horizon. This was the world of Guanyinyuan. It was a complete world. It had its textures and its rhythms, its cold and its warmth, its smell of millet cooking, and the particular creak of the meditation hall's floor in the third position from the right, where the boards had never quite settled. The monks who lived there were few, rarely more than 8 or 10 at any one time. The kitchen was simple. The provisions were whatever lay supporters brought from the village, supplemented by whatever the small vegetable plot produced in its modest, seasonal way. The meditation hall was draughty and lit by lamps that required constant tending, their wicks needing to be trimmed each evening before the long night sitting. Visitors came from considerable distances, scholars and poets, minor government officials, young monks who had crossed mountain passes on foot to ask their questions and receive whatever answers they could find. They came because an old man lived there. A very old man, by any reckoning. His name was Zhao Zhou Kongshen, and by the time he had settled at Guanyinyuan, he was already past 80 years of age. He would live to be 119, an almost incomprehensible span of time, during which the Tang dynasty itself would crumble, and the land would pass through wars and rebellions and 5 successive dynasties before finding any stillness again. Through all of this, Zhao Zhou sat in his cracked courtyard and swept his flagstones and drank his plain tea and spoke in short, sideways sentences that seemed simple until, days later, they opened something unexpected in the person who had received them. He had been many things before Guanyinyuan. He had been an 18-year-old novice, standing before the great master Nanquan Puyuan, trembling slightly, and asking what the way was, and receiving the answer that the ordinary mind is the way, and not knowing what that meant. He had been a wandering monk for decades, after Nanquan's death, crossing rivers and climbing passes, presenting himself at one monastery after another, asking questions, listening, sitting long nights in whatever corner was offered to him. He had survived the Huichang persecution, when 10,000 monasteries were closed and 260,000 monks and nuns were forcibly returned to civilian life. He had walked through burned temple courtyards and picked up fallen scripture pages from the mud. He had watched the tradition he loved be scattered like seeds in a storm, not knowing what would take root and what would be lost. And then, at 80, he had stopped walking. He had found this modest, ruined courtyard in the northern plains, with its crooked gate and its ancient cypresses, and he had stayed. For 40 years he stayed, and the staying itself became the teaching. A young monk named Weiming arrived at Guanyinyuan on a morning in late autumn when the frost was still thick on the flagstones and the sky was the color of unglazed clay. He had walked for 9 days from a monastery in the south, sleeping in farmers' outbuildings and roadside shelters, eating what he carried. He was 24 years old, lean from travel, earnest in the particular way that only the deeply intelligent can be earnest, which is to say, earnestly burdened. He had studied the great texts with genuine commitment. He could recite substantial passages of the Vimalakirti Sutra without hesitation. He had memorized the lineage of Chan transmission from Bodhidharma forward through 6 patriarchs and 12 generations, and could explain each generation's essential contribution in careful, organized sentences. He had sat retreats. He had asked his own master every question he could formulate. His master, a gentleman with a long white beard who taught in a valley where plum trees grew along the river, had listened to him for 3 years. And then one morning had said, with great kindness, "Go north, find Zhao, and leave your list at the gate." Weiming had a list. He had been writing it and refining it for nearly a year. Questions he had never been able to satisfactorily answer. Paradoxes in the teachings that seemed to point in contradictory directions. Aspects of practice that felt unresolved after years of effort. He had written them in careful columns on a folded piece of paper, numbering them in order of what seemed to him their importance. The list had 27 items. He had not left it at the gate. He had tucked it more carefully into the fold of his inner robe, telling himself that perhaps his master had meant this metaphorically. The list pressed lightly against his chest as he entered the courtyard of Guanyinyuan that morning, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. The courtyard was quiet. A monk was sweeping near the far wall, a small, elderly monk, moving his broom in long, unhurried strokes across the uneven stones. His back was slightly bent, and his robe was patched at the elbows. The sound of the bristles was the only sound. Weiming stood for a moment, taking in the courtyard, the ancient cypresses, the ginkgo in the corner, stripped of all but a handful of yellow leaves, the cracked walls with their climbing moss, the sliver of sky in the half-open gate behind him. It looked exactly like what it was, an old, modest temple that had survived by being overlooked. He had somehow expected something grander. He assumed the sweeping monk was a caretaker. He approached carefully, bowed, and asked where he might find the abbot, the master Zhao Kongshen. The sweeping continued for several more strokes. Then the old monk looked up. His face was deeply lined, not the lining of suffering exactly, but of time, of weather, of an enormous number of mornings. His eyes were quiet and clear, like water in a deep well after the rope has been withdrawn and the surface has had time to still. He looked at Weiming with mild, uncomplicated attention, not measuring him, not weighing him, simply seeing him the way one sees a bird that has landed briefly nearby. "Have you eaten your morning rice?" the old monk asked. Weiming blinked. The question was so ordinary, so completely outside the register of what he had prepared for, that he simply answered it, "I have, master." "Then wash your bowl," the old monk said, and returned to sweeping. It took Weiming several seconds to understand. He looked around the empty courtyard. There was no one else. The broom moved on, steady and unhurried. He had just been received by Zhao Kongshen, the man that practitioners across China spoke of with a reverence usually reserved for the ancient patriarchs, the man whose words had already begun finding their way into the collections of encounter dialogues that monks everywhere studied, and what he had received was a direction to wash his bowl. He stood in the cold courtyard a moment longer than was comfortable, not certain whether he had been welcomed or dismissed. Then, slowly, he went to find the water barrel near the kitchen. That was the first day. Weiming stayed at Guanyinyuan for 3 months, and in that time he received no formal lectures. There were no assembly halls with incense burning and monks seated in perfect rows, while a master expounded the Dharma from a high wooden seat. There was no ceremony of formal reception, no official designation of his role or his level. What there was, instead, was the continuous and seemingly unremarkable texture of ordinary days. The morning bell, a single heavy stroke that dissolved in the cold air like breath. The ritual of washing in water, so cold his hands ached. The preparation of the morning porridge millet, thin, sometimes flavored with dried mushrooms when the lay supporters brought them, sometimes without. The sweeping of the courtyard, which needed doing every morning because the cypress trees released their needles constantly, and because the wind brought dust from the plains beyond the village. The long afternoon sitting in the draughty hall, where the lamplight moved gently and the swallows' nests under the eaves were empty and dark now that winter had come. The evening bell, the particular quality of silence after the bell had finished and before sleep, and in the spaces between these activities, in the moments of transition, in the corridors and the kitchen doorway and the path between the well and the vegetable plot brief, and often startling encounters with Zhao Zhou, who moved through the temple's days as though each moment were entirely sufficient in itself, requiring nothing added and nothing removed. Wyming had come with his list and his 27 questions. He had come knowing that wisdom was available, and that this old man possessed it, and that the transaction of the journey, 9 days of walking, the cold, the worn sandals, the effort, ought by rights to produce an exchange of that wisdom, a transfer of understanding from teacher to student in some comprehensible form. This was how he understood learning. You prepared. You presented yourself. You asked. You received. You carried the answer forward. He waited for this to begin. Days passed, and it did not begin, or did not begin, in any form he recognized. On his third day, he managed to position himself near Zhao Zhou after the morning meal, while the old master sat in the courtyard looking at the ginkgo tree. The last 3 or 4 leaves remained on their branches, trembling faintly in the cold air. The sky was white and featureless. Wyming sat nearby, arranged his robe carefully, and cleared his throat. "Master," he said, "I have come a long distance with questions." Zhao Zhou did not look away from the tree. "I thought you might," he said pleasantly, as though this were a perfectly reasonable thing for a young man to do, arrive at a ruined temple in the northern plains, carrying 27 unresolved questions. There was no judgment in his tone. There was also no particular urgency. The first question concerns the nature of, "Do you see that leaf?" Zhao Zhou asked. Wyming looked. One of the remaining ginkgo leaves was in the process of releasing from its branch a slow, passion, spinning descent, turning in a nearly imperceptible draft of air, tracing a long, unhurried arc toward the stones below. "Yes," said Wyming. "What is it teaching you right now?" Zhao Zhou asked. Wyming opened his mouth and then closed it. The question had landed somewhere unexpected, below the level of his prepared thinking. He thought of impermanence, anicca, the teaching on impermanence from the Pali Canon, the way all conditioned things arise and pass. He began formulating an answer that drew on the Mahaparinibbana Sutta's final words, on Nagarjuna's understanding of dependent origination, on 3 or 4 different ways of understanding the falling of a leaf as an illustration of the doctrine of no self. He was composing this answer carefully, trying to find the most precise and comprehensive formulation. By the time he had settled on his phrasing, the leaf had landed. It lay on the cold flagstone, small and yellow, perfectly still. Zhao Zhou had risen from his seat, slowly and without comment, and was walking toward the kitchen. Wyming sat alone in the courtyard with his unspoken answer and a peculiar sensation. He could not quite name, Not embarrassment exactly, and not frustration exactly, but something that occupied the place where those emotions lived. The leaf lay on the stone. He looked at it for a long time. This is how it went, day after day. And the days accumulated into weeks, and slowly, without his willing it or understanding it, the watching began to change him. He noticed things he had not noticed before, or rather, he noticed that he had been failing to notice things that had been present all along. He noticed that Zhao Zhou never hurried, not in a deliberate performance of patience, way not the studied slowness of someone making a point about slowness, but in the way that a river does not hurry, because the river and its movement are not two separate things. He watched the old master eat with the same quality of quiet attention that other practitioners brought to formal seated meditation. He watched him fill the water barrel, holding the bucket with steady aged hands, watching the water fall in without any particular expression on his face, watching it simply, the way you watch something that is worth seeing. He watched him speak to the kitchen monk with a warmth that was neither effortful nor performed, a warmth like the warmth of a worn wooden surface that has absorbed decades of sunlight and radiates it back long after the sun has moved. One afternoon, a small delegation arrived from a nearby prefecture, a minor government official and 2 attendants. Dressed in the multiple silk layers that indicated regional authority, the official had come with a modest donation of rice and dried goods, and also with a question. He wished to know the secret of Chan. He said this quite directly, in the manner of people accustomed to asking for things and receiving them. I have heard that Master Zhao Zhou possesses the transmission of the ancient teachers. I would know the secret of Chan. Zhao Zhou received him in the courtyard. He brought out a small low table and placed 2 cups on it, and poured tea from a pot that had been warming near the kitchen, a plain, coarse tea, the same that the monks drank every morning, nothing ceremonial about it. He held the pot with steady hands and poured slowly, without spilling, and set the pot down and said nothing, while the steam rose from both cups. Then he looked at the official and said, "You have had a long journey." "Yes," said the official. "The road from, are your feet sore?" Zhao Zhou asked. The official stopped. He looked slightly taken aback, as though he had been asked a question on a completely different examination than the one he had prepared for. He glanced down at his feet. "They are," he admitted, with a slight note of surprise, as though he had not fully registered this until asked. "That is already considerable information," Zhao Zhou said. He lifted his cup with both hands and drank. The official waited for more. More did not come. He sat with the fact of his own sore feet and his cup of plain tea in a cracked courtyard in the northern plains, with an old man who had apparently offered him the secret of Chan in the form of a question about his feet, and then returned to drinking his tea. He sat for a long while, longer than he had intended, longer than his schedule permitted, longer than made obvious sense. And yet he stayed, because something in the quality of the silence, something in the warmth of the cup in his hands and the sound of the cypress trees moving in the afternoon wind, was doing something to him, loosening something behind his sternum that had been tight for a very long time, though he could not have said what it was or how long it had been tight. When he finally left, he had received no doctrine, no explanation, no systematic account of enlightenment and how to attain it. But something in his face had changed. A tightness around the eyes and mouth, something habitual and long established gone, or at least quieter. Weiming watched this from near the gate. He stood there for a long moment, After the delegation had departed, he chewed on what he had witnessed for the remainder of that day, and the 3 days that followed, turning it in his mind the way you turn a stone that is interesting, without yet knowing why. 5 weeks before he planned to depart, Wyming sat in the meditation hall through an entire long night, wrestling with himself in the way that earnest young practitioners sometimes do, with full seriousness and full sincerity, and something just barely crossing the line into self-punishment. He had the list. It was still in his inner robe, somewhat more worn now than when he had arrived. The paper softened at the fold lines from weeks of being carried against his body. He had been at Guanyinyuan for more than 2 months. He had asked almost none of his questions. He had swept stones and washed his bowl and chopped dried mushrooms for the soup, and sat in the cold hall and watched an old man do ordinary things with extraordinary ordinariness. And he felt, if he was entirely honest with himself, that he had somehow failed, that he had come all this way to receive something that was apparently not on offer, that the whole transaction had not occurred near the 3rd or 4th hour after midnight, when the lamp oil was low and the cold was at its deepest, and his legs had gone from painful to simply numb. He heard footsteps. Zhao Zhou appeared in the doorway with a small lamp, moving the way he always moved, without hurry, without ceremony, as though this were a perfectly ordinary time of night to be walking through a cold meditation hall. He saw Wyming sitting rigid and effortful on his cushion, and he came and settled himself nearby, placing the lamp on the floor between them. The flame was very still. The hall was very quiet. "You are suffering," Zhao Zhou said quietly, not as a diagnosis, not as a judgment, simply as an observation, in the same tone he might use to observe that the frost was thick this morning. "I came to learn," Wyming said. His voice, when it came out, was tighter than he intended. "Yes," said Zhao Zhou. He did not say anything else for a while. "But there have been no teachings," Wyming said. "No formal instruction." "No." "How many times have you washed your bowl since you arrived?" Zhao Zhou asked. The question stopped Wyming entirely. He thought, every morning without fail, for more than 2 months. "Perhaps 70 times, he said. "And what did the bowl teach you?" Zhao Zhou asked. The lamp flame was very still. The hall was very cold and very dark, beyond its small circle of light. Wyming stayed with the question. He did not rush toward an answer this time, and he noticed that he was not rushing, and he noticed the difference between that and all the previous times he had rushed. He let the question simply rest there, the way the bowl rested on its shelf each evening after being washed and dried. And something came, not a thought exactly, not a doctrine or a formulation, but something more like a recognition, arriving the way warmth arrives when you move closer to a fire, gradually and without drama. The bowl, every morning, came to him dirty. He washed it. It became clean. It had not complained in 70 mornings about being dirty. It had not celebrated in 70 mornings being clean. It received what was placed in it, rice, water, whatever came without preference and without resistance. It asked for nothing. It accumulated nothing. It was, each morning, exactly what it was, and nothing more. And it had been teaching him this, patiently and without any special announcement, every single morning. And he had picked it up and carried it to the water barrel with his mind full of questions about the nature of mind before birth, walking past the teaching as though it were a piece of the scenery. He said nothing, but something moved through his face, a releasing, The way a held breath releases, the way a knotted shoulder releases, when the tension finally exhausts itself. Zhao Zhou nodded once, slowly, as though he had heard something. The whole life is the scripture, he said. His voice was quiet, and even unhurried in the lamplight. Every moment of it, the cold flagstone under your feet in the dark of the morning. The smell of millet when it is almost cooked, but not yet. The difficulty of sitting still when the body wants to move. The strange, quiet satisfaction of a simple task, completed and set down. The sound of the gate in the wind. All of it is teaching. All of it, without pause, without intermission, without waiting for you to be ready. He was quiet for a moment. The flame moved once, a brief flutter, as though something nearby had exhaled. Then it still. The ones who cannot learn from the bowl come here and ask me for the secret. But the secret is what they walk through to reach the gate. Wyming sat with this for a long time. The lamp burned steadily. The cold pressed in from all sides, and through it the warmth of the small flame, and through that the strange warmth of something understood that does not yet have words. Eventually, without planning to, he reached into his robe and took out the list. He looked at it in the lamplight, the careful ink characters, the neat numbered columns, 27 questions that he had refined over a year. He looked at them for a while. Then he folded the paper once more and held it in his palms. He did not burn it. He did not throw it away. He kept it. But something in the keeping was different. Now, it was no longer a debt he owed reality. It was simply paper with writing on it interesting, worth returning to someday, no longer urgent. In the morning, when he washed his bowl, the washing was different. Not dramatically different from the outside. It would have looked identical to every previous morning. But something in the quality of his attention had changed. The cold water, the sound of the water, the weight of the bowl, the steam rising from the rinsing, all of it simply present, all of it simply itself, teaching nothing in particular, and everything at once. When he left Guanyin Yuan 5 weeks later, Zhao Zhou was in the courtyard, sweeping, or perhaps still sweeping. It was genuinely difficult to say, because the sweeping was so continuous and so settled into the fabric of the old man's days that beginning and ending seemed somewhat beside the point. As Wyming passed through the crooked gate and felt the sliver of morning sky widen into the full plain sky beyond, he paused. He heard the soft, rhythmic sound of bristles across stone continuing steadily behind him. He stood in the gap for a moment, with the temple world behind him and the open road ahead. He breathed in the cold air. He felt his feet on the ground. He walked on, and the courtyard breathed behind him, continuous and unhurried, teaching no one in particular, and everyone who happened to be there, and everything, and always. There is something in this story from 9th century China that touches something very old in you, something you may have carried for many years without quite finding a name for it. The feeling that wisdom is somewhere other than where you are, that the learning you need is waiting in a better book, a more advanced practice, a future version of yourself who has finally figured things out. Wyming walked 9 days with his list, certain that somewhere at the end of the road, the right questions would receive their answers. What he discovered slowly, without drama, in the rhythm of ordinary mornings, is what so many discover who stay long enough with genuine practice, who stay long enough with their own lives. The teaching was never withheld. It was always ordinary. It has always been ordinary. The bowl and the broom and the frost and the single yellow leaf completing its long, patient arc toward the stone. All of it was teaching, all along. Ordinary mind is the way. This was what Nan Quan said to young Zhao Zhou, and what Zhao Zhou carried for more than a century and offered, in his particular slantwise fashion, to everyone who came to him. Not a secret doctrine concealed in elevated language. Not wisdom that lives only in the extraordinary moments of dramatic realization. The way is ordinary. The way is whatever is actually happening right now. The weight of your head on the pillow. The small sound of your own breathing moving through the room. The particular quality of the darkness that surrounds you tonight. All of it is teaching. All of it has always been teaching. Let your breath come naturally now. Just this one breath. Just this. Feel your body settle a little further into the surface that holds you. You have been carrying a list of your own, not written on paper perhaps, but present nonetheless. The unresolved things, the questions about whether you are doing enough, becoming enough, understanding enough. They are real questions. They deserve attention. But tonight, they do not need answers. Tonight, the bowl simply needs washing. Tonight, the flagstones simply need to be crossed in the dark. Tonight, the flame needs only to burn. What Zhao Zhou understood and what Weiming touched in that cold hall in the long hours before dawn is that understanding is not the destination. Presence is the destination, the quality of attention you bring to what is actually here. The bowl has been teaching you every morning you have ever washed it. The difficulty that didn't destroy you was teaching. The person who disappointed you was teaching. The evenings when you sat quietly and couldn't name what you were feeling, teaching. The moment you stopped rushing and simply stayed with something that, most of all, let your shoulders soften now. Let that softening travel slowly down your arms, into your hand, into your fingers, which can uncurl now from whatever they have been holding. Let the breath carry that softening deeper than thought can follow it. Nothing to solve tonight. Nothing to understand before morning comes. The night is the teacher. Your breath is the teacher. The weight of your body is the teacher. All of it. This ordinary moment, this ordinary darkness, this ordinary breath returning again and again, like a monk returning each morning to the same bowl, and finding in the simple act of washing something quietly and permanently whole. And as that recognition settles that your ordinary life has always been your most faithful teacher, we travel now across the sea to Japan, where another monk in a different century arrives at a completely different kind of ordinary moment and finds waiting there exactly what he had been searching for. The mountain arrived before the monastery did. That is how it felt to anyone walking the last hour of the road to Aheiji, the great cedar-forested slopes of the Ekazen Highlands, pressing down on either side of the narrow valley path. The air growing cooler with each step, the light shifting from open sky to something filtered, amber and silver by turns. The way light behaves when trees have been standing for a very long time and have developed their own opinion about where it ought to fall. The year was in the middle of the 13th century. Autumn had come early to the mountains of Fukui province. The maples along the lower ridges had turned red before the equinox, and the mist that gathered in the valleys each morning stayed longer than it had any business staying, hanging among the cedars in long pale ribbons that dissolved slowly as the morning progressed, as though the mountain were taking its time deciding what to reveal. Aheiji, the Temple of Eternal Peace, was a young monastery then, barely a decade old, carved out of the forested hillside by the monk Dogen Zenji and a small group of disciples who had followed him away from the politics and pressures of the capital. The buildings were simple, constructed of local timber that still smelled faintly of resin when the air was cold, their rooflines following the slope of the mountain rather than imposing any human geometry upon it. The meditation hall, the kitchen, the abbot's quarters, the communal bathing room, the wood store, all of it fitted together into the hillside, the way a hand fits into a worn glove, shaped by the particular contours of the place rather than the reverse. In the mornings, the bell sounded across the valley, and monks went to the meditation hall in robes that steamed faintly in the cold, their breath marking their passage through the pre-dawn, dark in small temporary clouds. A young monk named Ryokan had arrived at Eiheiji in midsummer, full of purpose. He was not the great Ryokan of the later centuries, the eccentric poet monk beloved across Japan for his calligraphy and his willingness to play with children, but a different young man who happened to carry the same name. A coincidence the universe sometimes permits itself. This Ryokan was 22 years old, the eldest son of a minor provincial official in province. A family of modest means and considerable literary pretension. His father had owned perhaps 200 books, an extraordinary number for a household that was not a temple, and Ryokan had read most of them by the time he was 17. He had read the Lotus Sutra and the Diamond Sutra and a commentary on the Heart Sutra that he'd found wedged behind a cabinet and that had belonged, apparently, to his grandfather. He had read Chinese poetry and Japanese poetry and several Chinese histories and a text on calligraphy that he had never quite mastered in practice, but admired deeply in principle. He had arrived at Eiheiji. In other words, carrying a great deal of knowledge about Buddhism and a genuine, sincere aspiration to understand it not just intellectually, but truly, in the way the texts described. He had read Dogen's earliest writing, Fukanza Zengi, a short text on the universal promotion of seated meditation, and something in its language had moved him in a way he couldn't fully account for. He had decided, after a year of deliberation, to leave his family and his father's books and his future as a minor official's son and walk the 2 days to the mountain temple where the author of that text now lived and taught. He had not expected to be assigned to the kitchen in the monastic structure of Eiheiji, as Dogen had organized it in accordance with the Song Chinese model he'd encountered during his years of study abroad. The kitchen was not a secondary function, a place where those unsuited to higher work were managed out of sight. The tenzo, the head cook, held one of the 6 principal offices of the monastery, and the role was considered suitable only for monks of mature practice and deep understanding. Dogen had written about this with unusual vehemence, unusual even by his own standards of intensity. The kitchen was a place of practice. The preparation of meals was an expression of the same awareness required in formal seated meditation, and any monk who treated washing rice as less important than sitting on his cushion had misunderstood something fundamental about the nature of the way. Ryokan did not know this yet, or rather, he knew it intellectually. He had read the relevant passages, but the knowledge had not yet moved below the level of words. He presented himself to the senior monk on his first morning, bowing carefully and waiting with the particular readiness of someone who expects to be asked to prove himself in an interesting way. He was assigned to the kitchen. He was told to report to the tenzo, an older monk named Genchu, who had been managing Eiheiji's kitchen since the 3rd year of the monastery's existence, and who had a way of communicating information through silence and gesture that Ryokan found, initially, deeply frustrating. Genchu was perhaps 55 years old, broad through the shoulders, with large work-worn hands that moved with surprising precision among the pots and cutting boards. He spoke rarely, and, when he did, spoke briefly. His instructions tended toward the concrete and specific. These mushrooms need to be soaked before the third bell. The water for the morning rice must be started while the mist is still on the valley. The floor needs sweeping before the pots are set. He offered no explanations for why these things needed to be done in this particular way, at this particular time. And when Ryokan carefully, lightly, once asked the reason for a specific instruction, Genshu had looked at him for a long moment, with a mildly interested expression, as though Ryokan had said something in a language Genshu could almost understand, but not quite, and then simply repeated the instruction. The kitchen was a long, low room at the back of the main building complex, its ceiling blackened by years of cooking smoke, its packed earth floor worn smooth and slightly concave near the fire pit from thousands of passages across the same ground. The smell was complex: rice steam, dried mushroom, wood ash, the faint sweetness of the cedar timbers overhead, something older and deeper underneath all of it, that was simply the smell of the room itself, accumulated over years of cooking and winter cold, and the warm breath of many monks working in close quarters. There were 3 large iron pots of different sizes, a stone rice washing basin, a wooden cutting surface worn down in the center from long use, and a series of shelves holding ceramic bowls, small jars, cloth pouches of dried vegetables and seeds, and a row of wooden utensils arranged in descending order of size. The fire pit was set into the floor, fed from a woodpile stacked against the north wall in a configuration that Genshu maintained with the same attention he brought to everything, each piece of wood placed, not simply deposited. For the first 2 weeks, Ryokan experienced something he could only describe, in his own careful interior language, as a kind of humiliation that he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to feel. He washed rice. He soaked mushrooms. He swept the floor. He carried water from the stream below the kitchen in wooden buckets that were heavier than they looked, and that, on the path up the stone steps, required a quality of attention he kept abandoning in favor of thinking about other things, which caused him to slosh water onto the steps and have to go back for more. He cut dried gourd into strips of a specific width. Genshu would hold up a completed strip and look at it, and then at Ryokan without comment. And this look contained more instructional information than anything Ryokan's father's books had managed. He had expected to be sitting in the meditation hall by this time. He had expected koans. He had expected, he could admit to himself in the honesty of 3 o'clock in the morning, when the kitchen was cold and he was alone with the fire he had to tend through the night for the morning meal. Something that felt more like what he had read about. More like the encounters between masters and students that were so vivid and charged and alive in the texts. More like the piercing moments of clarity he'd read about in the accounts of awakening. The world suddenly knew, the ordinary made radiant. Instead, there was the floor, which needed sweeping again because the wind had come through the low kitchen window and deposited cedar needles across the clean surface he had swept an hour before. The floor that always needed sweeping, the water that always needed carrying, the rice that always needed washing, 1 grain by 1 grain sinking through the cold water while his hands went numb. One morning in the 6th week, after the first frost had come and the morning water in the stone basin formed a thin skin of ice that he had to break with his knuckle before beginning the rice washing, Ryokan was working in the kitchen alone, waiting for the fire to take in the damp morning air, listening to the sound of the first bell carrying across the valley. Genshu was at morning meditation. The kitchen was very quiet, except for the small sounds of the fire beginning the first tentative crackling, the hiss of moisture in the wood, the gradually deepening tone of something catching. He was looking at the rice, He had poured it into the washing basin and was about to begin the rinsing, his numbed hands poised above the cold water, and for reasons he could not entirely account for, perhaps because he was tired, perhaps because the bell across the valley had sounded with unusual clarity in the cold air, perhaps because the frost on the kitchen window had arranged itself into a pattern that caught the first pale light. In a way, he had no words, for he paused. He simply looked at the rice, the individual grains, each one slightly translucent in the early light. The tiny variations between them, this one a shade darker, this one with a small blemish along its length, this one perfectly formed in a way that seemed almost excessive, almost too much itself. He looked at the rice, and something very quiet happened, which was that he stopped thinking about the rice and simply saw it. He could not have said, afterward, how long he stayed this way. The fire behind him had moved through its initial uncertainty and settled into a steadier burning by the time he came back to himself, and the first pale light through the kitchen window had shifted from grey to something warmer. His hands had gone further into the cold. He lowered them into the water and began rinsing, and the rinsing was the same as it always was, the motion of his hands in the water, the cloudy white water draining away, the gradual clarification, and yet somehow the quality of his attention inside the rinsing was different. Not dramatic, not illuminated, but present in a way it had not been before, in the same way that a room in which someone attentive has entered is different from a room that is merely occupied. Genshu returned from morning meditation while Ryokan was setting the large pot over the fire. The older monk moved through the kitchen doing the things he always did, upon returning checking the progress of the fire, setting out the bowls, measuring the water for the porridge, and said nothing. When the porridge was cooking and they were standing in the kitchen's particular companionable silence, Ryokan found himself saying, without fully planning to, I think I understood something this morning. Genshu looked at him. The look was attentive, but unexcited. The way you look at weather present, registering, making no particular demand. About the rice, Ryokan said. Genshu said nothing. About how the rice doesn't know what I think about it. Ryokan said, and felt immediately that he had said it wrong, had translated back into words something that had not been words, and had lost something essential in the translation, about how it's just completely itself. Genshu stirred the porridge with the long wooden spoon. The spoon moved in slow circles. The steam rose. After a moment he said, when washing the rice, treat the water as your own lifeblood. Ryokan recognized this. It was something Dogen had written, something from the great text on kitchen practice. He had read it. He had read it twice and thought he understood it, and moved on. He stood in the kitchen now, with his cold numbed hands and the smell of cooking porridge around him, and felt the sentence land somewhere below the level of comprehension, somewhere closer to the body, to the hands that had been in the water, to the particular quality of light through the kitchen window on a cold morning in a mountain monastery, while the bell continued sounding across the valley. He wept, briefly. He didn't entirely understand why, and Genshu gave no indication of having noticed, continuing to stir the porridge with the same unhurried circles, which Ryokan came to understand later was a form of profound respect, the refusal to make his small opening into an event, the insistence that the cooking continue, that the porridge be ready when the monks came from meditation, that the day continue as days do, carrying its student along inside its ordinary moving. After that morning, the kitchen changed, or Ryokan changed, which may have amounted to the same thing. The floor still needed sweeping. The water was still cold and the buckets still heavy on the stone steps. The mushrooms still needed soaking before the third bell, for reasons Genshu had never explained, but which Ryokan was beginning to understand, did not require explanation. The mushrooms knew the reasons. The water knew the reasons, and his hands were slowly learning to know them too. But the quality of his attention inside these tasks was different now. He began to notice things he had been walking past for weeks. The way the smoke from the fire moved differently on humid mornings versus dry one, and how this affected the temperature of the porridge if you didn't compensate. The way the cedar smell in the kitchen timbers was strongest in the first hour after dawn, when the temperature difference between night and day was greatest. The way the sound of the rice in the washing basin, a particular soft churning, changed when the grain was truly clean, becoming less turbid, more open. Somehow, he began to understand what Genshu was teaching, which was something that could not have been delivered in a lecture and could not be received from a book. It was not a piece of information. It was a quality of relationship with what was actually happening, the capacity to be completely in the kitchen rather than in some idea of the kitchen, completely with the rice rather than with some narrative about rice washing as spiritual practice. It was not that the task was special. It was that the task was ordinary, and the ordinary, approached with full attention, turned out to be inexhaustible. This is not a small discovery. Let that settle for a moment. Most of us move through our days with a portion of ourselves elsewhere in the morning, thinking about the evening. In the evening, reviewing the morning. We carry our activities rather than inhabit them. We wash the dishes, thinking about the conversation we need to have. We walk to work thinking about what we'll do when we arrive. We arrive and we think about when we'll leave. The activity that contains us is treated as a transit zone, a space between the meaningful moments, which are always elsewhere, always arriving soon. Ryokan's discovery in the kitchen of Eiheiji was simply this: the transit zone is the destination. The space between the meaningful moments is the meaningful moment. The rice washing is not the prelude to the meal that will allow the monks to sit in the real practice of the meditation hall. The rice washing is the practice. The rice washing and the meditation and the sweeping and the bell and the cold water and the warm fire, all of it the same, teaching, appearing in different form, asking the same thing each time. Are you here? Are you actually here? With this, right now? This is what Dogen meant when he wrote his great text on kitchen practice and insisted that only monks of mature understanding be given the role of tenzo. He did not mean that cooking required advanced spiritual credentials. He meant that mature practice is visible in how you hold a pot. It is audible in how you move through a kitchen. It is present in whether you treat the water as your own lifeblood or as something to be disposed of on the way to somewhere more important. There is no somewhere more important. This is what the kitchen teaches. This is what every ordinary place teaches, if you will stay in it long enough, with enough genuine attention to receive what it is offering. Feel your body right now, just this. The weight of where you are, the temperature of the air on your face or your hands, or whatever small area of skin is aware of the night around it. This body you are resting in, right now, is not a waiting room. This breath is not a pause between more significant breaths. This moment is not the transit zone between the moments that will finally matter. This moment is the rice, completely itself, asking nothing but your full, simple presence. This is what the kitchen teaches. This is what Genshu knew. Moving through his kitchen without explanation, his large, careful hands holding each task as though it were the only task, which in the moment of holding it, it was completely, without remainder. You don't need to understand this fully. Let that thought rest. Now, let the breath do what the breath does. The body do what the body does. The night hold you the way the mountain holds. Eheji steadily, without effort, without asking anything in return. If your eyes are closing, let them close. If sleep is arriving, let it arrive. It is the right teacher for this hour. You don't need to stay awake to receive what this night is offering. It is offering it continuously to your open hands, to your resting body, to the part of you that doesn't need to understand in order to know. And as the kitchen's warmth gives way to the quiet of the mountain evening, we travel now to the Korean peninsula, where a different kind of ordinary moment waits in the high stone mountains of the sea. The mountain was called Jogi-san, and it had always been a mountain with opinions. Not the dramatic opinions of volcanic peaks or sheer granite faces that announce their difficulty from a distance, but the quieter, more stubborn opinions of a heavily forested Korean mountain whose ridgelines shifted with the seasons and whose paths rearranged themselves imperceptibly depending on how much rain had fallen and how long ago. In autumn, the slopes ran red and orange from ridge to valley floor, a burning that was not destruction, but simply the mountain saying, in its seasonal way, that nothing permanent had been promised. In winter, snow came early and stayed long. The pine branches bowed under it, and the sound of the mountain changed completely. The birds stilled, the streams slowed to a murmur under their ice, and the wind in the high pines made a sound that was not quite singing and not quite mourning, but occupied the space where both of those live. The monastery of Songwangsa had been built into the lower reaches of this mountain by the reforming monk Jinul, who had spent the better part of his adult life trying to accomplish something that his contemporaries mostly considered impossible: the unification of Korea's fractious Buddhist schools into a single community of genuine practice. The temple's full name meant the community of monastics of monks and nuns, committed not to political positioning or the accumulation of royal patronage, but to actual practice, actual sitting, actual attention. Jinul had moved there in the final decade of his life, settling into the stone and timber buildings that stepped up the lower mountain slope in careful terraces. Surrounded by the particular silence of forested Korean highlands, a silence layered with bird call and water sound, and the occasional distant bell of the main hall. He called himself Moguja, the ox herder. This was a deliberate choosing. In the tradition of the 10 ox herding pictures, the famous sequence of images that depicted the stages of awakening, the ox represented the practitioner's own original nature, wild at first, then glimpsed, then caught, then tamed, then riding freely, then forgotten, then gone beyond, even forgetting into the open field of no separation. Jinul had arrived at his own understanding through 3 distinct breakthroughs spread across his life. None of them dramatic in the way such moments are sometimes depicted. No thunder, no light, no sudden collapse of the ordinary world into blinding clarity. Each had been quiet, precise, and utterly ordinary in the manner of its arrival. The first had come while reading the Platform Sutra of the 6th Patriarch, sitting in a temple study room while rain fell outside and other monks moved through their duties in the corridors. The second had come while reading a passage of the Avatamsaka Sutra beside a mountain stream, the water's sound present throughout. The third, years later, while reading Dahui's record of Huadu practice, alone in a hermitage above the snow line on a cold morning when the ink in his brush had been slow to flow. He did not speak of these experiences as achievements. He spoke of them as clarifications, moments when something he had already known became visible in a different way, the way a familiar face becomes suddenly legible in a certain quality of light. And he spent the remaining years of his life trying to offer his monks not the experiences themselves, which could not be handed across, but the conditions under which such clarifications might become possible. Among the monks who had found their way to Songguangsa during those late years of Jinul's teaching life was a young man named Sokshol. He had come from the northwestern province of Huanghe, the same province where Jinul had been born 50 years before, the son of a family that had farmed the same land for 4 generations and had, 4 generations ago, been considerably more prosperous than they currently were. Seokyo had been the brightest of 6 children, the one who devoured the few books the family owned, and then borrowed more from a neighbor who had once been a minor government official and still possessed a modest library. He had learned to read Chinese characters young, which was unusual for a farmer's son, and had spent several years trying to find a way into official life, passing 1 examination, failing a second, passing a third that led nowhere, because the position it should have opened had been quietly given to someone whose family connections were better established than his modest intelligence. He had come to Buddhism sideways, the way many do not, through a sudden conversion or a dramatic crisis, but through an accumulation of smaller failures that gradually stripped away the possibility of the life he had been trying to build. By 26, he had tried 3 times to find his way into an official career, had failed twice and succeeded once, in a way that led nowhere, and had finally sat down on a riverbank on a spring morning when the willows were trailing their new leaves in the current, and allowed himself to genuinely wonder whether the thing he was seeking, stability, recognition, the right to feel that his intelligence had been honored by the world, was actually findable. The wondering had led him through a chain of meetings and recommendations, and one pivotal conversation with a traveling monk who had studied under a student of Jinul's principal disciples, Toyo Deshon. He arrived at Songguangsa in early summer, lean from travel, his scholar's hands already roughened from the weeks of walking. He received his robes, his beginner's instructions, his sleeping mat in the monk's dormitory where 12 other novices slept in a row. He received his huadu. The huadu assigned to him was the oldest and most famous one in the Korean Seon tradition, the single-syllable mu. A monk had once asked Zhao Zhou, the great Tang dynasty Chinese master whose sayings had crossed the sea to Korea, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" And Zhao Zhou had said, "Mu," which meant no, which meant neither yes nor no, which meant a question that cannot be answered from within the question's own frame. This syllable, this non-answer, this living paradox was placed in Seokjeol's hands like a burning coal, and he was told, carry it, not in the sense of holding it at a distance, not in the sense of thinking about it, in the sense of pressing it against the center of your chest and walking with it pressed there, through every hour of every day, until either you or the question dissolved, and they turned out to have been the same thing. For the first month, Seokjeol was certain he was doing it correctly. He carried the huadu with concentration and seriousness. He sat with it in the meditation hall. He walked with it during kinhin, the slow walking meditation between long sitting periods. He brought it to the kitchen when he helped with the morning meal, and to the water carrying, and to the sweeping of the courtyard stones after the wind had decorated them with pine needles overnight. He was, by any external measure, a diligent practitioner. The trouble was that when Seokjeol carried the huadu, he also carried his analysis of the huadu. He carried his progress reports on the huadu. He carried his comparison of his relationship with the huadu to what the texts described and what the other novices seemed to be experiencing, insofar as he could infer this from their faces during meditation, which he admitted to himself was not a reliable source. He carried, in short, not the question, but his idea of carrying the question, which is a very different and considerably heavier thing. He knew this. He had read enough to know the distinction between genuine Huadu inquiry, the direct, unmediated pressing of the question against the bedrock of awareness, and the subtle continuation of scholarly analysis, wearing the costume of practice. He knew it, and knowing it did not help, because the very act of knowing it became another object of his analysis. He was now analyzing his analysis, which produced a third layer of analysis, observing the analysis of the analysis, all of it stacked in careful tiers, like the monastery's terraced stone walls, each layer neat and solid and entirely the wrong architecture for the kind of knowing that Seon was pointing toward. He went to Jinul in the 4th month. The teaching interviews at Songwangsa were not formal in the elaborate ceremonial sense of some other traditions. No striking of staves, no shouts designed to shatter the ordinary frame of consciousness. Jinul received his monks in a small room off the main hall, seated on a low platform, with a window that looked out onto a section of the lower mountain slope where a stand of bamboo grew. The bamboo was always doing something, moving in the wind, holding snow in winter, casting its particular shifting shadow across the ground in summer. It was always teaching. Jinul was always teaching by looking out at it. Seokyeol entered and bowed and presented his situation as honestly as he could, which took some courage, because what he had to confess was not dramatic failure, but something more embarrassing, competence in the wrong direction. He was very good at thinking about his practice. He was considerably less good at practicing. Jinul listened without interruption. When Seokyeol had finished, the old master was quiet for a moment, looking out at the bamboo. The light through the window moved across the floor in long, slow patterns. Then Jinul said, "When did you last stop knowing?" Seokyeol considered the question. He was not certain he had understood it correctly. "Master, I am not sure." "Not stop trying," Jinul said. "Not rest. Not take a break from your efforts. Stop knowing. Stop being someone who knows things about his own practice. When did you last disappear?" Seokyeol had no answer. The silence in the small room was the kind that does not fill with sound, but simply becomes more present. The mind that analyzes the Huadu is the same mind. The Huadu is designed to dissolve. Jinul said, "You are trying to think your way into the place where thinking ends. You are using the very instrument that is the problem to try to solve the problem." He paused. "Do you see the bamboo?" Seokyeol looked. The bamboo moved in a light wind outside the window, its stems a deep green, its leaves trembling in their irregular, responsive way, responsive to each smallest variation in the air, unable to resist anything, unable to hold onto anything. "The bamboo does not know it is bamboo," Jinul said. "It does not analyze its own bamboo nature. It does not compare its growth to other bamboos, or measure its progress toward perfect bamboo realization. It simply moves with what moves it. This is the teaching it has been giving since before you arrived, and will give after you leave." He looked at Seokyeol directly. "Your Huadu is not a puzzle to be solved by the part of you that solves puzzles. It is a fire. You cannot understand a fire. You can only let it burn what it burns." Seokyeol returned to the meditation hall. He sat with the Huadu. He sat with it in a way that was different from before, not because he had acquired a new technique, but because he had been stripped of his confidence in the old one. The analysis, for a while, simply continued out of habit, the way a wheel continues spinning briefly after the hand is removed. But under the analysis, there was now something else, a faint quality of genuine not knowing, like a small patch of open sky visible between clouds. It was not resolution. It was not the breakthrough the texts described. It was something earlier and more fragile than that, the first evidence that the question was actually alive inside him, rather than sitting on a shelf, being occasionally examined and replaced. The weeks that followed were not comfortable. The mind, deprived of its habitual strategy, cycled through alternatives, periods of forced blankness that were actually effortful suppression, periods of sudden conceptual activity that he recognized as his scholar's mind attempting a side entrance, periods of frustrated stillness, where nothing seemed to be happening at all. These were the moments his teacher had warned about, the dark valley between the giving up of the old way and the arrival of anything new. The gap where the honest practitioner lives when they have stopped pretending and not yet arrived anywhere. Seokyo walked the mountain paths during Kinhin on an afternoon in mid-autumn. The maples already turned, the air sharp and clean with the particular clarity of Korean highland autumn, when something happened that he later found impossible to describe accurately. He had been carrying the hwadu, not analyzing, simply carrying, the way you carry a stone when a single maple leaf released from its branch and fell slowly across the path in front of him. He watched it fall. He did not think impermanence. He did not think a lesson about letting go. He simply watched the leaf fall, and in the watching, the watcher became momentarily transparent, and the leaf fell through where the watcher had been, and the question that had been pressed against his chest moved through that same transparency, and for a breath, exactly one breath, neither more nor less, there was no one carrying anything, and the mountain was entirely itself, and the falling leaf was entirely itself. And what is called mu was neither yes nor no, but simply the unobstructed fact of what was there. It closed again. He was Seokcheol again, on a mountain path, breathing the cold air, the leaf now on the ground. But something had been shown, not given, permanently shown. The way you show a child a door that has always been there, but that the child has never noticed, because they have been looking everywhere else. He went on walking. The mountain went on being the mountain. The path went ahead through the red and orange and gold of the turning forest, entirely unimpressed by what had just occurred, and entirely correct in its unimpressedness, and entirely, completely, the teaching. There is a pattern that almost everyone who thinks carefully about their own mind recognizes. Eventually, it is the pattern of seeking insight as a solution to the experience of not having insight, of using the mind's analyzing capacity to try to arrive at the place where analysis itself is no longer the primary mode of meeting the world. It is not unintelligent, quite the opposite. It is what intelligent minds naturally do, because the mind that has learnt to think its way through problems applies this skill to every problem it encounters, including the problem of itself. And for a very long time, this appears to be working, because thinking about practice looks a great deal like practicing. From the inside, this is the pattern that Seokcheol discovered in himself on Jogyesan Mountain in the 14th century of the Common Era, under the guidance of a monk who called himself the ox herder, and it is the same pattern you may have recognized in yourself, perhaps many times, perhaps recently. The mind that narrates its own practice, the mind that compares where you are to where you think you should be, the mind that, even in the act of trying to rest, quietly constructs a report on the quality of the resting, reaching for insight about insight, building layers of understanding about understanding, until the architecture becomes so elaborate that the original open space, which was never lost, which was always there, has simply been temporarily occluded. Jinul's teaching sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, was not a formula. It was a description of something that actually happens. The initial recognition of what you already are comes suddenly, unbidden. through a moment you cannot manufacture, like a maple leaf falling across a mountain path at the exact right angle in the exact quality of October light. But what comes before that recognition is the long, patient work of making space, of noticing the patterns, of seeing clearly how the mind covers what it is looking for with its looking. The gradual cultivation is not the accumulation of merit or understanding. It is the gentle, persistent release of the accumulated layers of strategy. Let that settle now. Feel where in your body you are holding the weight of your own analysis of how you are doing at anything. At sleep, even. Notice if there is a part of your awareness right now that is quietly grading this moment, measuring your relaxation, comparing your stillness to some internal standard of what stillness should feel like. That is the scholar's mind. It is not a failing. It is simply what minds do. Notice it, the way Sokhshol noticed the bamboo with mild interest, without judgment, without trying to fix what you're noticing. Let your shoulders soften. Let the breath do what the breath does. The Huadu of this night is simply what remains when you stop knowing. You don't have to answer. If you drift off, that is perfect. If sleep arrives like a maple leaf crossing the path, let it cross. You don't need to analyze its approach. Feel the weight of the dark around you, the surface beneath you, the particular temperature of this hour's air. These are the mountain's teachings, offered freely, without syllabus, to anyone willing simply to be here and receive them. And as the mountain holds its silence, as the bamboo moves with whatever moves it, we travel now across the water, again south and west, to the warm riverlands of Vietnam, where a different kind of mind encounters a different kind of teaching in the waters of the Mekong's reaching tributaries, where the lotus grows, not despite the mud, but entirely because of it. The mountain of Yen Tu had been considered sacred long before Buddhism arrived in Vietnam. The people who had farmed the red-earthed valleys below it for generations called it the Western Heaven, and they meant this. Both practically the mountain lay to the west, and its clouds gathered there before the rains, and spiritually, in the way that high places accumulate the weight of human longing over centuries, until the longing itself becomes a kind of gravity. Pilgrims had been climbing it for as long as anyone could trace, though what they were climbing toward had changed name and form many times. By the final years of the 13th century of the Common Era, they were climbing toward a man. He was known by many names. His birth name had been Tren Kham. His royal title, on ascending the throne of Dai Viet at the age of 21, had been Trần Nhân Tông. His monk's name, taken when he finally climbed Yen Tu mountain and removed the silk robes of royalty for the rough cloth of a renunciant in the year 1299, was Hung van Dai Do Da, the great ascetic of fragrant cloud. The people of Dai Viet, who loved him with the particular ferocity that a people reserves for someone who chose them when he could have chosen otherwise, called him simply the King Buddha. He had been, before this, a genuinely great king in the operational sense. He had governed wisely, cultivated alliances carefully, and twice led his country's armies against the Mongol forces of Kublai Khan, an emperor who had at that point conquered most of the known world, and who had never expected serious resistance from the small, humid kingdom at the southeastern edge of his ambitions. Twice the Mongols had come, and twice they had been turned back in 1285 and 1288, not through any single decisive battle, but through a sustained, intelligent resistance that used the land itself as a weapon, the river deltas, the monsoon season, the jungle terrain, the willingness of a people to endure enormous hardship rather than submit. The king had been present for all of it. and he had emerged from each campaign, not triumphant in the hollow way of rulers who celebrate victories from safe distances, but changed, as people are changed by genuine encounter with what mortality actually means for the people they govern. Between campaigns, and during the long years of his reign, he had studied Buddhism seriously, not the ceremonial Buddhism of the court, with its elaborate rituals and its role as a stabilizing ideological prop for dynastic power, but the interior kind, the kind that asked difficult questions about the nature of mind, the nature of suffering, the nature of the compulsion to accumulate power, and what that compulsion actually serves. He had a teacher, a remarkable lay Buddhist named Tuệ Trung Thượng Si, who taught him the first essential lesson of the Tien tradition with a directness that startled the young king. There is no Buddha in the mountains. Buddha is right in the heart. A quiet heart that understands, that is the true Buddha. Now, if your majesty is enlightened in that heart, you will immediately become a Buddha, without having to search outside. The king had held this instruction for 20 years while governing a country, managing a court, raising a family, and surviving 2 invasions. He had held it the way you hold a seed before the right season arrives to plant it. And when, at the age of 41, he abdicated in favor of his son, climbed Yen Tu mountain, and began the work of establishing what would become the Truc Lam, the bamboo grove school of Vietnamese Thien, he understood that the 20 years of waiting had not been a delay. They had been the teaching. Among the many hundreds of students who made their way up the mountain to study with him was a woman from the river provinces of the Red River Delta named Min Chao. This was unusual. The mountain monasteries were predominantly male spaces, and the formal structures of religious authority in Dai Viet, at that time, accommodated women's practice with limited institutional support. Min Chao had found her way to Yen Tu through a sequence of events that she sometimes described as accidental and that she privately understood to be nothing of the kind. She had been the wife of a river merchant, a man of considerable energy and modest wisdom who had traded lacquerware and silk upriver toward the Chinese border and dried fish and salt downriver toward the coast for 15 years, with varying success. They had had 3 children, 2 of whom had survived past infancy. She had managed a household, kept accounts, raised children, maintained relationships with suppliers and buyers who occasionally required the management that her husband lacked the temperament for, and generally been the stable center of a life that was full and demanding and genuinely good in most of the ways a life can be good. And that had never quite touched whatever it was in her that wanted touching. She was 43 years old when her husband died of a fever contracted during a trading journey in the wet season, leaving her with a modest business, 2 grown children who had their own households, and a quality of solitude she had not expected and did not know what to do with. For 2 years, she managed the trading business out of habit. Then, one morning, she woke before dawn and lay in the dark listening to the river, outside the Red River, moved past the town with a sound like someone breathing steadily in sleep. Unhurried, continuous, and she understood, without drama, that she was going to close the business and climb a mountain. Her children were disturbed by this. Her eldest, a son named Quoc Bao, who had his father's energy and rather more of his own wisdom, came to her and asked what she was looking for. She found she could not answer precisely. She was not in despair. Despair was something she understood from observing others, but it was not her particular affliction. She was not fleeing her life. She had loved it. She was simply aware, in the particular way that awareness sometimes arrives without announcement, that something in her had been pressing gently against a closed door for as long as she could remember, and that the remaining years of her life were probably the right time to find out what was on the other side. She climbed Yentu in early autumn, when the mountain trails were dry and the forest on the lower slopes had not yet begun its seasonal color change. The air grew cooler and thinner as she climbed. The forest changed character. Lower down, it was dense and humid, full of the sound of insects and birds. Higher up, it opened into something more austere. The trees, smaller and more widely spaced, their forms shaped by wind rather than competition for light. Their roots gripping exposed rock with a patience that seemed almost intentional. By the time she reached the cluster of hermitages and teaching halls near the summit where the patriarch resided, her legs ached and she was breathing deeply, and the view below was vast enough to produce a sensation somewhere between vertigo and wonder. She was received into the community, given accommodation in a small stone-floored room shared with 2 other women practitioners, and assigned to the morning and evening meditation periods in the main hall. She was also, on her second day, received briefly by the patriarch himself. He was smaller than she had imagined. Men of great historical significance are always smaller in person than the space they occupy in the mind. He was slight, perhaps 60 years old by this point, his face carrying the particular kind of weathering that comes not from difficulty alone, but from difficulty that has been genuinely met, rather than merely survived. He moved with a quality of unhurried attention that Min Chao recognized from her years of managing a trading household, the attention of someone who knows what matters and does not waste movement on what doesn't. He received her in a small room, open on one side, to a narrow view of the valley far below, where the mist was still lying in the low places, even though it was mid-morning. He asked, simply, what had brought her to the mountain. She told him honestly, the river merchant husband, the trading life, the good children, the years of being useful and present and genuinely engaged, and the persistent sense of something closed, something unaddressed, something that she had been circling without being able to name. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley mist. Then he said, when you were managing the household, the accounts, the children, the negotiations with the traders, were you present? I was, she said. Were there moments of satisfaction in that work? Many, she said, carefully. And yet, you felt something was missing. Yes. He turned to look at her directly. His expression was neither warm nor cold. It was simply attentive in the way of someone who has stopped performing either warmth or distance, and simply looked. The feeling that something is missing, he said, is itself the teaching you came here to receive, not the answer to it. The feeling itself. Min Chao sat with this. It was not what she had expected. She had expected, she realized, some form of instruction, a practice, a text, a systematic approach to opening whatever was closed. She had not expected to be pointed back at the experience she had climbed a mountain to resolve. The door you have been pressing against your whole life, the patriarch said, is not a door to somewhere else. It is a door to here. And it opens inward. She stayed on Yentu for 2 full years. The life of the mountain community was structured and simple, in the way that structures become simple when they have been distilled over time into what is actually necessary. Morning meditation before dawn, communal work in the hours after tending the small vegetable terraces, maintaining the buildings, carrying water from the spring that issued from the rock face on the north side of the summit, afternoon formal study periods, evening meditation, sleep. Within this structure, she found something she had not found in the full and busy life below, and it took her a long time to understand what it was, because it was not something added but something subtracted. the persistent background hum of incompleteness, the sense of pressing against the closed door simply quieted, not because the mountain was special, not because the meditation was producing some elevation of consciousness unavailable to the woman who had kept accounts beside the Red River, but because, for the first time she could clearly remember, she had stopped looking sideways at her life from a position of wondering when the real one would begin. The insight arrived quietly, on an afternoon in the second winter, while she was carrying water up the stone path from the spring. The path was icy in places and required attention. The water buckets were heavy, and the consequences of inattention on an icy path on a mountain were significant. She was attending to the path, the weight, the cold air on her face, the specific way her breath timed itself to her steps, and at some point, the attending and the path and the cold and the breath were not separate, things being tracked by a separate observer, but simply what was happening, and what was happening was complete. She stood on the icy path for a moment, the water buckets in her hands, the valley far below lost in winter haze. Nothing extraordinary. Water, cold, path, breath, hens, and inside all of it, the quiet that she had climbed the mountain, looking for, which had not been on the mountain at all, or rather, had been available everywhere and always, and which the mountain had simply provided enough stillness for her to finally stop moving past. She went to the patriarch. She told him what had happened, as simply as she could, which was not very simply, because the experience resisted simplification, but she tried. He listened, the way he always listened, entirely, without hurry, without performing interest, because the interest was genuine. When she finished, he said, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." He smiled a small, precise smile, the kind that contains more information than a lecture. You carried this understanding across the Red River Delta for 43 years. The mountain did not give it to you. The mountain gave you nowhere else to look. This became one of the foundational teachings of the Truk Lam school, that enlightenment is not found in special places or special states. It is found when looking stops, being a way of leaving what is already here. The patriarch's poem said it plainly, in the way that genuine insight tends to be plain once it has been fully arrived at. Living in the world, enjoying the way, just follow circumstances. When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep. Inside the house, there is treasure. Just seek it. Faced with circumstances, remain unperturbed. But the word "just" in that poem is doing enormous work. Just follow circumstances. Just eat when hungry. There is nothing easy about the just. For most of us, eating when hungry is accompanied by a narrative about whether we should be hungry, whether this is the right food, whether someone else has enough food, whether our hunger is appropriate given what we haven't yet accomplished. Sleeping when tired arrives, wrapped in resistance, too much undone, too much still unresolved, too much of the life not yet figured out before we are permitted to rest. The just is a lifetime's practice. The just is what Min Cho found on the icy path, in the middle of the ordinary act of carrying water. And this is what the pattern looks like, when you can see it clearly from the outside, the persistent background feeling that the real life has not quite started yet. That peace is available somewhere ahead, after the things you are currently managing have been resolved. That rest is permitted once the list has been completed, and the list is never completed. That presence is available once you arrive somewhere more settled than where you currently are, and the arriving keeps being deferred. This is the mind's great specialty, the future peace, the earned rest, the conditional permission to be here, and the teaching that Min Shao received on Yentu Mountain, that Tren Nhan Tong offered from the depth of a life that had included genuine political crisis and genuine grief and genuine responsibility, and then the genuine willingness to set it all down and climb a mountain, was simply, it is not conditions that make peace available. It is the recognition that peace was available inside the conditions, always, and that looking elsewhere was the only thing ever preventing it. You have been doing this, very likely for a long time. The looking elsewhere, the waiting for the list to complete itself, for the circumstances to settle, for the version of your life in which rest is finally permitted to arrive. This is not a failing. This is the thing the human mind does. It manages. It projects. It plans. It evaluates. It keeps an inventory of what remains unfinished. This is its nature. And the practice, not the mountain practice, not the formal sitting practice, but the practice of this exact moment, right now, in the dark of this ordinary night, is to notice the looking and allow it to rest. Let your breath come without you managing it. Just this breath, arriving and releasing, carrying nothing. Feel the weight of your body exactly as it is, not the weight of what you still need to do, not the weight of what you should have done differently, but the simple physical weight of a body that has been moving through this day and has now stopped moving. That weight is completely ordinary. It is also the only moment of rest you actually have access to, not the rest that will come after the circumstances resolve. This rest, this stillness, this ordinary breath in this ordinary dark, in this ordinary body. When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep. You are tired. The permission has always been there. The house has always had its treasure. The door opens inward, and inward is here, is now, is the exact quality of this moment before sleep. Let your shoulders soften. Let the breath do what it always does. When you stop managing it, return. Deepen. Slow. The mountain does not hold the peace. The silence does not live in the hermitage. It lives in the moment of putting down the water buckets and standing on an icy path in winter and finding nothing missing. Nothing missing. Just this. Just this breath. Just this dark. Just this body resting in the only moment that has ever actually been available. And as the stillness deepens, as the water buckets are set down, as the path is left behind, as the mountain recedes into the haze of approaching sleep, we travel now to the island of Sri Lanka, where a monk in a different century encounters a different kind of ordinary moment beside a different kind of water, and finds inside it the same inexhaustible stillness that is always waiting in the space where searching has finally rested. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, the island of Lanka was covered in a great deal more forest than it is today. The broad central plains, where today's dry zone irrigation tanks catch the monsoon rains and hold them through the long dry months, were in that era dense with the particular vegetation of tropical lowland forest stands of tall, ebony and satinwood, the dense canopy broken occasionally by rocky outcrops where weaver birds constructed their intricate pendant nests. The forest floor, moving with mongoose and monitor lizard, and the occasional slow passage of an elephant following its own ancient paths to water. The air in the dry season had a quality of copper-colored heat that pressed on everything, and the air in the wet season smelled of wet red earth, and the particular dark perfume of fungus on fallen wood, and the sweetness of frangipani that grew wherever the tree had found a foothold in stone. Into this landscape, in the ancient city of Anuradhapura, the great King Devanampiya Tissa had built the Mahavihara, the great monastery. He had built it to house the monks brought by Mahinda Thera, the son of Emperor Ashoka, who had brought the Dhamma across the waters from India and presented it to the king on the rocky summit of Mihintale, with the particular directness that Theravada Buddhism has always preferred to ceremony. The Mahavihara had grown over the following centuries into something that had no simple equivalent in the world: part monastery, part university, part library, part community of practice, sustained across generations of monks who chanted the Pali texts in the early hours before dawn and sat in formal meditation in the long afternoons and argued, occasionally with considerable heat, about questions of doctrine that mattered to them with a seriousness that is difficult to fully appreciate from a distance of 2,000 years. By the time the story we are entering had reached its central moment, the Mahavihara had been standing for something close to 3 centuries. The great stupa of Ruwanvelisaya had been completed under King Dutuhamanu, its white dome visible from miles in any direction, its surface smooth as the inside of a shell, its height producing on anyone approaching across the flat plain the sensation of something rising not from the earth but from behind it, as though a second sky were pressing upward from below. The monastery's grounds stretched across what had once been the royal pleasure garden, mango groves and flowering trees between the stone-flagged paths that connected the meditation halls, the lecture halls, the refectories, the residences of the senior monks in their individual kutis, and the common areas where junior monks practiced their recitations under the sometimes patient and sometimes exasperated supervision of their teachers. Among the junior monks in residence during this period was a young man from the southern coast whose ordination name was Nandia. He had come from a family of fishermen from a village where the smell of the sea was so constant that the people who lived there had ceased to notice it, in the way that the monks of the Mahavihara had ceased to notice the smell of sandalwood incense, it being simply the ambient condition of the world they inhabited. Nandia's father had fished the same stretch of water for 30 years. His grandfather had fished it before him. The sea had provided, mostly, what the sea provides: enough, and sometimes more than enough, and sometimes considerably less, and always on its own terms, which had never been negotiable. Nandia had left this world at 17, ordaining under a senior monk named Ravata, who visited the coastal villages on teaching tours each dry season, and who had noticed in the young fisherman's son a quality of attention that was unusual and worth cultivating. He had been at the Mahavihara for 4 years by the time this story takes place. He had memorized substantial sections of the Sutta Pitaka. He could recite the Dhammapada from beginning to end without error. He had sat through hundreds of meditation sessions in the Great Hall, learning to observe the breath, to note the arising and passing of sensation, to meet the mind's tendency to wander with gentle redirection rather than force. He was, by all accounts, a diligent and promising monk. He was also, as he himself was beginning to understand with increasing clarity, someone who had learned a great deal about letting go without yet being able to actually do it. The particular object of his difficulty was not dramatic. It was not a romantic attachment, or an addiction to sensory pleasure, or an ambition for status within the monastery's hierarchy. It was something smaller, and in some ways more stubborn. He could not stop worrying about his family. This was not unreasonable. His mother was aging. His father's health had been uncertain for the past 2 years, a persistent cough that the dry season dust made worse, that the wet season damp also made worse, that seemed to make itself worse, regardless of the conditions, as though it had developed its own agenda. His younger brother, who had taken over the fishing, was not as capable as Nandia had been, and knew it. which produced in him a compensating bravado that Nandiya recognized with love as the particular kind of fearlessness that sits directly over a deep uncertainty. When lay supporters visited the monastery and brought news from the coastal regions, Nandiya listened with an attention that he was fairly sure his teacher Revata had noticed and had chosen so far not to come out on. The Theravada tradition was unambiguous about what Nandiya's relationship to his family's difficulties should be. He had renounced the household life. He had taken the precepts. He had accepted the robe and the bowl and the life of formal practice. And the life of formal practice required a different relationship to personal attachment than the one he was currently maintaining. He knew this as doctrine. He could explain it in Pali. He could trace it through the suttas, the Buddha's clear instructions that the monk, who returns constantly to the concerns of the household life, is like a man who has crossed a river and then stands on the far bank, worrying about the bank he left behind, unable to continue his journey, unable to return, achieving nothing except the additional suffering of a divided mind. He understood this. Understanding it did not help. There was a pond near the eastern edge of the Mahavihara's grounds, a rectangular reflecting tank fed by an underground channel that connected it to the larger irrigation system of the city. Lotus grew there in considerable quantities, their leaves lifting from the water on their flexible stems, and their flowers opening and closing with the light in cycles so reliable you could use them as a rough measure of the time of day. White lotus opened earliest, reaching their full width before the heat of mid-morning and closing again by early afternoon. Pink lotus held longer. The deep red ones, the rarer ones, stayed open into the late afternoon and sometimes into the early evening if the day had been mild. Nandiya went to this pond when he had work time available, ostensibly to practice walking meditation on the flagged path along its northern edge. This was legitimate. Many monks used the path, but he also sat sometimes on a low stone bench at the path's end and looked at the lotus, not practicing anything in particular, simply sitting with the particular weight of his concern about people far away who were managing without him. One afternoon, in the dry season, when the heat had gathered to its full intensity in the hours after midday, and the monastery was in the quietest part of its daily cycle, most monks in their residences, the teaching halls empty, the flagged paths largely silent, Nandiya was sitting on the stone bench looking at the pond when his teacher Revata appeared on the path and came to sit nearby without particular ceremony. Revata was perhaps 60 years old, a compact man of the lowland plains, dark-skinned from decades of outdoor practice, with close-cropped grey hair and a quality of stillness about him. That was not the stillness of suppression, not someone sitting on something, but the stillness of someone who has simply stopped generating unnecessary movement. He was one of the forest monks by temperament, though he spent part of each year at the Mahavihara, and there was, in the quality of his attention, something that had been shaped by long hours alone in the dry zone forest, by the particular education that the forest gives to anyone who will receive it. He sat beside Nandiya for a while in silence. The lotus were doing what the lotus did, the white flowers already beginning their afternoon closing, the petals folding inward with a slowness that required patience to observe, but that rewarded observation with the specific satisfaction of witnessing something complete itself. The pink lotus in the center of the tank was still fully open. Their reflections in the water below them were trembling slightly in a light afternoon wind. "What do you see?" Revata asked. Eventually, Nandiya looked at the pond. He gave the question genuine attention, not the quick answer that would demonstrate his learning, but the slower kind of attention that the question seemed to be asking for. "Lotus," he said, opening and closing, And what does the lotus that closed this morning know about whether it will open again tomorrow? Rivata asked. Nandya was quiet. This was a question about Anika, about impermanence, and he knew all the doctrinal answers to it. He knew that the lotus knows nothing, that the lotus has no self to do the knowing, that its opening and closing is simply the arising and passing of conditioned phenomena in accordance with the natural law of dependent origination. He knew this the way he knew the Dhammapada as text that had been carefully stored in a part of his mind that was adjacent to his actual experience, but not quite continuous with it. The lotus that closed this morning doesn't know, he said, and yet it will open. Or it won't, Rivata said, depending on conditions that neither it nor you can control. Nandya said nothing. The pink lotus trembled in the wind. Your father's cough, Rivata said, simply, without preamble, without apology. Nandya looked at his teacher. He had not spoken directly to Rivata about his father's cough. He had not spoken about it to anyone. You carry it with you, Rivata said. The way a man carries a stone in his bowl, it's there in everything you eat. He paused. Tell me the carrying. Does it help him? No, Nandya said. The honesty of this cost him something, but he paid it. Does it help you? No. And yet, you carry it. I love my father, Nandya said, and his voice was steadier than he expected. Yes, Rivata said. There was no dismissal in this, no suggestion that love was wrong or that the monk's path required its absence. You love him. That is correct. And loving him, you want his life to be better than it is. And you want the power to make it so, and you don't have that power. And the gap between what you want and what you can do sits in your chest like something that won't dissolve. He looked at the lotus. This is the second arrow. Nandya knew this teaching. The Buddha had taught the doctrine of the two arrows. The first arrow is the pain that life brings: illness, loss, aging, the difficulty of conditions that don't accommodate our preferences. The second arrow is the one we fire at ourselves when we refuse to receive the first, the resistance. The why does this happen? The if only, the urgent, helpless labor of a mind trying to think its way out of something that cannot be thought away. The first arrow is unavoidable. The second is optional. Knowing this did not make it easy to put down. I understand the teaching, Nandya said. Yes, Rivata said. You understand it. Now look at the lotus. Nandya looked. The pink flower in the center of the tank was fully open, its petals curved back to expose the deep yellow center, the surface of each petal carrying its particular texture, its particular pale to deep shading from base to edge, each stamen perfectly itself and already slightly altered from what it had been an hour before. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because this is simply what matter does. It moves. It is always in the process of becoming slightly different from what it was. That flower opened 3 days ago, Rivata said. In 2 days, it will have shed its petals, not because anything wrong happened to it, because this is what opening things do. He was quiet for a moment. Your father was born. He fished. He had children. He taught you to read the sea, yes. I know he taught you this. I know the kind of attention you bring to moving water. He has loved the people in his family with the consistent, unspectacular love of a man who shows up every morning and does what the day requires. This is a complete life, whether the cough resolves or does not, whether you are present or not. It is a complete life. Something moved in Nandia's chest, not resolution. Not the clean release of a knot coming undone all at once. More like the first slight loosening of a very long tension, the kind that has been held so long it had become invisible. He breathed. The breath came more deeply than it had been coming. The lotus doesn't close because it fails. Revata said. It closes because closing is part of what it does. Anicca impermanence is not a tragedy that happens to things. It is the nature of things. The nature of your father's life. The nature of yours. The nature of this moment, which is already becoming the next one. He rose from the bench, unhurried. The movement of a body that has no argument with the process of rising. The work, he said, is not to feel less. The work is to let what you feel move through you the way the wind moves through the lotus, changing nothing essential, disturbing nothing permanent, leaving the flower entirely itself. He walked away along the flagged path. Nandia sat with the pond. The afternoon moved. The white lotus had closed fully now. Each flower, a small pointed bud, holding its form against the late light. The pink ones were beginning their own slow closing, the petals drawing inward by degrees, too small to observe directly but visible over the span of minutes, as though the flower were exhaling very slowly after a long-held breath. The red ones, in the far corner of the tank, remained open. They were the stubborn ones, or perhaps simply the ones whose conditions permitted them to stay a little longer. Nandia breathed. He thought of his father, not as a problem to be managed, but simply as a man, a particular man, with large sun-darkened hands and a way of reading the wind direction from the movement of coconut palms on the beach that Nandia had watched since he was small and had never stopped finding beautiful. He allowed the love he felt for his father to be simply love, not love plus panic, not love plus helplessness, not love plus the second arrow of wanting to fix what couldn't be fixed. Just love, just the simple, real thing, without the weight of what he could not do. This is the specific work of letting go that the Theravada tradition describes with such care, such patience, such insistence on precision. Not the suppression of feeling, not the cultivation of distance or detachment in the sense of coldness, but the discovery always felt directly in the body before it becomes knowledge that the feeling and the resistance to the feeling are two separate things, that the love can remain entirely while the grip on outcome loosens, that you can feel the full weight of caring for someone and simultaneously release the weight of believing that your caring can prevent what cannot be prevented. The flower closes. The wind moves through. Nothing permanent is disturbed. The love, which is not a conditioned thing, remains. Feel your body right now. Feel what is held in it tonight, the people you carry, the outcomes you are supervising with the portion of your mind that never quite rests. Let them be present. Don't push them away. They are there because you love, and love is correct. And now, very gently, not forcing, not deciding, not performing the letting go, but simply turning your attention to the breath. Notice that the breath is not concerned with any of it. The breath is simply doing what breath does. Arriving, leaving, completely at ease with the whole process. This is the lotus in the pond. This is your body in the dark, opening and closing in its own time, in accordance with conditions you did not set and cannot alter, which does not mean that it is not completely, entirely, perfectly itself. Let your shoulders soften. Let your hands uncurl from whatever they have been holding. The people you love are resting in their own lives tonight, exactly as they are. in accordance with the conditions of their own, arising, which is both the most difficult truth and the most liberating one. You do not need to carry them here. Your love does not require it, and they cannot feel it there. They can only feel love when you are present. And you are present here. Now, breathing, in the dark, feel the weight of the surface beneath you, how it holds you completely, how it asks nothing, how it offers everything it has to give. Let the breath deepen. Let sleep arrive the way the lotus closes, not from failure, not from giving up, but because the light is changing. And this is what the body does when the day is done. And as the lotus closes quietly in the dark water, as the breath deepens and the mind begins its slow drift toward the place where thinking rests, we travel now across the breadth of Asia, north and east, to the high, cold plateaus of Tibet, where a different teacher in a different century sits in a cave above the snow line and watches the sky with the particular patient attention of someone for whom sky and mind have stopped being different things. The valley of Lapchi opened like a cupped hand holding snowmelt. It lay in the high borderlands between Tibet and the kingdoms to the south, a place the great teacher Mapa had told his student was among the most sacred of all sites, the speech mandala of Chakrasamvara. He had called it and had said, "Go there. The place will hold your practice." So Milarepa had gone, and the place had held his practice, and in the decades since, he had first arrived, wearing only a thin cotton robe against a cold that would have killed most men, his green-stained skin from years of living on boiled nettles, the only evidence that something far stranger than ordinary biology was operating in his body. Lapchi had become the primary residence of what could only loosely be called his household. Kavis, mostly, several of them, at various elevations on the mountain faces that ringed the valley. A small clearing between two rock outcrops where his students sometimes gathered to hear him sing. The sky above it all, present and enormous, changing constantly with weather that came from both directions south, from the high passes toward Nepal, north from the Tibetan plateau, and that had educated Milarepa in the particular way that sky educates anyone who lives under it long enough without obstruction. He was, by this point in his life, somewhere in his middle years of serious practice past the worst of his early trials, the tower building and tower demolishing that Mapa had demanded as the price of his teaching, past the long, terrifying plunge into his own violence and its consequences, past the years of solitary retreat that had left him physically diminished and spiritually vast, in the way that certain extreme processes produce their opposite. He had begun to teach in earnest, and students had found him drawn by rumors that traveled the trade routes and pilgrimage paths like seeds carried by the wind, settling wherever the ground was receptive. The students who came to him were unusual in their variety, merchants who had lost everything and found in that loss the first genuine question of their lives, monks who had practiced for decades and found something still closed in them that formal study had not opened, young men of family and prospects who had looked at the life ahead of them and found it somehow insufficient, though they had no precise name for the insufficiency. Rechungpa had come in this last category. He was a young man from central Tibet, 19 years old, when he first found Milarepa, the son of a minor landholder who had died before Rechungpa was old enough to know him clearly. He had been raised by his mother, a woman of considerable character and practical intelligence who had managed both the estate and the education of her son with a combination of love and high expectation that had produced in Rechungpa a young man who was simultaneously deeply capable and chronically uncertain about whether his capability was sufficient for the regard it sought. He had studied Buddhist texts. He had debated. He had sat in formal meditation at a local monastery and found it valuable but incomplete in a way he could not explain, like a room that had good furniture but no windows. He had not planned to find Milarepa. He had been traveling to visit a teacher in the south and had taken a route through the high passes that brought him into the valley of Lapchi on a day in early autumn, when the air had just begun to carry the first edge of the coming winter, not cold yet, but clarified in the way that high-altitude air clarifies in autumn, a quality of transparency that made the distances look both further and more precise. He had heard singing, not performing singing, not ceremonial singing, but the kind of singing that happens when someone is occupied with something, the way a farmer sings without meaning to, over the work of an afternoon. He had followed the sound to a small clearing, where an older man, in a white cotton robe that was thoroughly inadequate for the temperature, was sitting on a flat rock, looking at the sky, singing in a language that Rechungpa could follow well enough to understand. He was singing about the sky as the nature of mind, and the clouds as thoughts arising and dissolving within it, and the space between thoughts as the place where what is real has always been waiting without impatience. Rechungpa had sat down on the ground nearby and listened until the song finished, which took some time. When the man finally stopped and looked at him with mild, uncomplicated interest, Rechungpa felt the particular vertigo of being seen by someone who has no agenda regarding what they see, someone who is looking simply because looking is what is available in this moment, requiring nothing from you in return. You are carrying something, Milarepa said. Rechungpa considered denying this, then considered what the denial would cost, then said, "My mother died 4 months ago." Milarepa nodded. Not the nod of someone making a concession, the nod of someone receiving information that connects to something they already understand from the inside. "And you are still carrying her?" Milarepa said. "Yes." "Describe to me exactly how." This was not the question Rechungpa had expected. He had expected, he realized, sitting on the cold ground of a valley he had not planned to enter, looking at a man he had not known existed 40 minutes ago, some form of consolation, a teaching about impermanence, a prescription. He had not expected to be asked to describe the mechanics of his grief with precision, as though Milarepa were a careful physician asking about the location and quality of a pain rather than its name. He tried, though. He tried honestly, because something about the quality of Milarepa's attention made dishonesty feel not exactly wrong but simply pointless, like trying to light a fire in a room that is already lit. He said the carrying was like this. He woke each morning, and in the first moment of waking, she was alive, and then she was dead, and the becoming dead happened again, every morning, which meant that in 4 months she had died something approaching 120 times, and each time was not smaller than the time before, and in the day, things kept requiring her absence, her handwriting in the records of the estate that he had inherited, the particular way she had organized the small storage room off the kitchen, a habit she had of being interested in whatever he was interested in, that had shaped what he chose to be interested in more profoundly than he had understood, until the interest stopped having anywhere to go. He carried these things. He carried the sense that the world had been rearranged in a way he had not consented to and could not appeal. Milarepa listened to all of this. He did not hurry it. When Rechungpa finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky above the valley, which was doing what it always did, moving, shifting, light through cloud, through light again. The blue beneath everything always there, and always the same quality of blue, regardless of what passed through it. When you describe carrying her, Milarepa said, which of you is carrying the other? Rechungpa sat with this. He did not understand the question immediately. which Milarepa had clearly anticipated because he said nothing further and simply waited in the way that rock waits, not impatiently, not generously, simply with the complete absence of the need for the current state of affairs to be different from what it is. After a while, Richungpa said, "I am carrying her." "Yes," said Milarepa. "You are carrying your idea of her. The mother who was alive, arranged in your mind. You are pressing it against your chest and walking around with it pressed there, and the pressing is what you call grief." He paused. "This is not wrong. It is what love does when it has nowhere to go. But let me ask you something. Where is she, right now? In your body, not the idea of her, the love itself. Where does it live?" Richungpa considered. The question was strange, but not unreasonable. He put his hand on his sternum, slightly to the left. He was surprised to find that the location felt accurate, that there was something there that was not just the ache of loss, but something warmer. Something that did not require her continued existence to be real. Something that was his, that she had made by being the specific person she had been, that was not going anywhere regardless of what happened to the form it had gathered around. "There," he said. "Yes," Milarepa said. "That is yours. She gave you that. It lives in you, not in the continuing fact of her. The continuing fact of her is what changed. The love did not change. The love is still there, in that place in your chest where you just put your hand. She lives there, not as something you are carrying, as something you are. There is a difference. The distinction sat between them like a stone placed carefully on level ground, neither heavy nor light. Simply there, available to be examined from all sides. Richungpa turned it. He had been treating his grief as evidence that she was still present, in some form he was responsible for maintaining. He had been holding on with the conviction that the holding itself was a form of love, that releasing the hold would be a form of abandonment, that letting the acute ongoing pain resolve in any way would be disloyal. This was the shape of it. This was the second arrow, though he would not have called it by that name. The sky above you right now, Milarepa said, contains clouds. The clouds are moving. Some have already left the valley. In the time we have been sitting here, is the sky diminished by their passage? No, said Richungpa. And when a cloud passes, when it is no longer visible, does this mean it was never there? No. Your mother moved through the sky of your life, Milarepa said. She was real. She shaped the sky itself, the particular quality of attention you bring to things, the particular warmth in your chest that appeared just now when you looked for her. She is not the cloud that has passed. She is part of the sky. She is in the quality of the sky. You cannot carry the sky, and you do not need to. The sky carries you. Richungpa sat with this for a long time. Milarepa did not rush him. The sun moved across the valley in its autumn trajectory, lower in the sky than it had been a month ago, producing that particular long-shadowed afternoon light of high-altitude October that makes everything look like it is being seen through amber. A bird crossed the clearing, a lemurgia, fast-winged, moving with the effortless authority of something that has mastered its relationship with air, and neither of them spoke until it had gone. What happened in Richungpa in that long silence was not a dramatic release. It was something quieter and more durable than drama, a gradual reduction of the grip. Not the ending of love, the ending of love's misunderstanding of itself. He had been gripping as a form of loyalty. He was beginning to understand that the grip was actually what was separating him from what he loved, that the pressing of the held form against his chest was preventing the love from doing what love does naturally, when it is not impeded, which is to move through you freely, to inform your care for the living, to make you more present in the world rather than less, to become over time, without effort, simply the quality of who you are. He did not say any of this. The afternoon held it. Milarepa seemed to know it was being held. He sang again, briefly, a verse from one of his cave compositions about the nature of mind as the nature of sky. And the verse said that the sky does not grieve the passing of clouds, and that the sky is not indifferent. It is the container in which everything appears and everything is received without rejection, without grasping, without preference for the cloud that has just arrived over the cloud that has just gone. Rechungpa stayed in the valley of Lapchi for 3 years after that afternoon. He became one of Milarepa's 2 principal students, the moon-like one. The teachers later called him, as Gampopa was called the sun-like one, and the designation pointed to something true about his quality of practice, more reflective, more interior, shaped by that early encounter with grief into someone who understood from the body, rather than the intellect alone, what the teaching of releasing without abandoning actually meant. This is the teaching that Milarepa gave in that valley, and in the caves above it, and in the songs he sang while looking at the sky, that the mind, like the sky, is not diminished by what passes through it. That the heart's most faithful expression of love is not the grip, but the openness. That the deepest holding is what happens when we stop holding, when we allow the love to become part of the sky of who we are, rather than a cloud we are trying desperately to keep from moving. This is what you are invited to do right now, in the specific quiet of this night. Not to release what you love, not to perform a letting go that is actually a pushing away, but to feel, in the place in your chest where love actually lives, not the idea of it, not the narrative of it, but the warmth of it, which is real and available to feel that it is already free, that it doesn't need to be carried, that you are not responsible for maintaining its existence through the effort of your grief, that the people you love, the people you have lost, the people you miss with a specific ache that you would recognize anywhere, they are not the cloud. They are in the quality of the sky. They are in the specific warmth in your chest that you would feel right now if you put your hand there and breathed. Feel that. Let it be warm without gripping it. Let it be real without needing to be held in place. Just this warmth. Just this breath. Just this sky of awareness that has received everything, the joy and the grief and the ordinary afternoon and the extraordinary loss, without being diminished by any of it, without being different from what it has always been, vast, open, still, and entirely capable of holding you right now, exactly as you are, exactly as everything is. Let your breath deepen. Let your hands uncurl. Let the tightness around whatever you are carrying begin to soften, not because you are releasing it, but because you are recognizing that you never had to hold it in the first place. The love lives in you. It always has. It is not going anywhere. And as the sky above Lapchi holds its mountains and its clouds and its vast indifferent stars, as the breath moves freely through the open chest of this resting body, we travel now, quietly, to the high desert of the Tibetan plateau, where the sky above a different cave is teaching a different lesson to a different woman who has been sitting with the same question all her adult life and has finally arrived somewhere she did not know she was going. The mountain hermitage of Gangri Thokar sat at an elevation where winter arrived, not gradually, but decisively, as though it had been waiting just above the cloud line, and changed, and had then descended all at once, a transformation over 2 or 3 days from the last warmth of late autumn into something that made warm seem like a different country, remembered but unreachable. The name meant White Skull Snow Mountain, which was either ominous or reassuring, depending on one's relationship to the fact of impermanence. And the great teacher, who had chosen to live and write and die there, was quite clear about his own relationship to it. He had named one of his most important works, Trilogy of finding rest in the nature of mind, finding rest in illusion, finding rest in meditation, and he had written these works in the high cold air of Gangri Thoka with the kind of clarity that comes to a mind that has stopped being distracted by anything warmer or more comfortable. His name was Longchen Rapyam, which meant infinite vast expanse. He was also called Drime Oza, stainless light. He was, depending on who was counting and which texts were consulted, either the most brilliant or the second most brilliant writer and thinker in the history of the Nyingma tradition, a tradition that valued brilliance highly, having been founded by Padmasambhava himself, a figure so extraordinary that subsequent generations had mostly given up trying to improve on the description. Longchenpa had been born in 1308 in the Tra Valley of southern Tibet, to a father who was a tantric yogi and a mother who died when he was 9. He had studied at Samye, Tibet's first monastery. He had studied at Sangpo Notok, the great scholastic college, mastering the entire curriculum of Buddhist philosophy, Madhyamaka, Yogacara, Abhidharma, epistemology, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the point of mastering these systems was not to possess them, but to see through them, to what they pointed at. He had received teachings from the third Karmapa, Rangjung Dorje. He had entered a period of retreat in complete darkness for 8 months in the winter of 1332, during which, by the traditional accounts, he had visions of a young girl who promised to watch over him, and during which, by any account, something clarified in him that had been in the process of clarifying for years. He had spent his middle years in the mountains, moving between hermitages, writing. His productive output was almost incomprehensible, over 270 works, of which roughly 25 survived the various catastrophes of Tibetan history, and these survivors included works of such philosophical precision and poetic beauty that centuries later, teachers from every school of Tibetan Buddhism, including those not affiliated with the Nyingma tradition, would still cite them as authoritative accounts of what the mind actually is when you stop confusing it with what moves through it. By the period that concerns us, the final years of his life, sometime in the 1350s or 1360s, the exact date being uncertain in the way that exact dates in medieval Tibet are often uncertain, Longchenpa was spending most of his time at Gangri Thoka, in a stone hermitage that was modest in the way that genuinely important places tend to be modest, solid, functional, cold, with a view from the eastern window of a range of lesser peaks standing against the sky like an ink-brushed silhouette. The sky above these peaks was the primary feature of the landscape. It changed constantly, morning's thin blue clarified by midday into something almost translucent, then slowly deepening through afternoon into a blue, so saturated it seemed to have weight. Then the colors of sunset unrepeatable and unrepeated, then the stars in their enormous indifferent numbers, then the pre-dawn dark, then again the morning. This sky had been Longchenpa's principal teacher for years. Not metaphorically. Actually, among the students who had found their way to Gangri Thoka was a young woman named Palmo. She was from a family of landholders in the eastern part of Yutsang, a family that had produced several capable men and one daughter who was more capable than any of them. A fact that the family had processed with a mixture of pride, unease, and the particular creativity of people who want to promote the intelligence they see without disrupting the structures that intelligence might eventually exceed. She had been educated by a local lama, had learned to read both the classical scripts, had studied the foundational texts of the Nyingma tradition with a thoroughness that had led the lama to say, after their final session together, something she had turned over many times since, "I have taught you everything I know. The rest will come from somewhere I cannot take you." She was 31 years old when she arrived at Gangri-Thoka. She had been practicing formal meditation for 11 years, not occasionally or casually, but seriously, in the way that people who have discovered that the mind is more interesting than everything else become serious about looking at it. She had sat for long periods. She had practiced the preliminary foundations. She had worked with the visualization practices of the generation stage with the particular exactness that her mind's natural precision required. She had done all of this conscientiously, and she had experienced by any reasonable standard considerable depth in her practice. She had encountered states of stillness and clarity that were not her ordinary experience, and that had moved her in ways she could not account for using the vocabulary of ordinary psychology. And she had a problem. The problem was this: every state of clarity she encountered in meditation was eventually interrupted, and the interruption had the same quality regardless of how refined the clarity had been. A thought would arise, or a sound from outside the meditation hall, or a sensation of discomfort in her back after long sitting, and the clarity would rupture. And she would find herself on the other side of the rupture, looking back at the clear state, the way you look back at a room you have just left and cannot re-enter. And in the rupture, there was always the same quality, the sense that she was the clarity, that the clarity was something she produced and possessed and was responsible for maintaining, and that anything that interrupted it was interrupting her, was taking something that was hers. This was the problem she brought to Longchenpa. He received her in the small room adjacent to his study, which contained a low seat, a window, and a great deal of cold air that neither of them appeared to find remarkable. He listened to her description of her practice. He listened to the description of the problem without any particular visible response, not dismissal, not recognition, not the slight shift of expression that indicates a teacher has heard this before and already knows the answer. Simply listening, in the way of someone for whom listening is itself a practice. When she finished, he said, "When the thought arises and the clarity ruptures, who is it that is watching the rupture?" Palmo considered. "I am," she said. "Yes. And that the one who watches does it also rupture?" She held this. The honest answer, which took a moment to locate beneath the answer she had been preparing, was no. Whatever was watching the clarity arise and watching the clarity rupture was not itself ruptured by either event. It was simply witnessing, unchanged. "No," she said. "Then what is that?" Longchenpa asked. She had no answer. This was not the same as not knowing. The not knowing felt different from ignorance. It felt more like standing in front of a door that she had not previously noticed because she had been standing with her back to it. "Let me ask you something," Longchenpa said. "When a cloud passes through the sky, does the sky become a cloud?" "No," she said. "When the cloud dissolves, does the sky become the dissolution?" "No." "When a storm comes and fills the entire sky with cloud and rain, and the blue is invisible for days, where has the sky gone?" She saw where this was going and stayed with it rather than rushing toward the conclusion. "Nowhere," she said. Eventually, "The sky hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there. The storm is in it. The storm is not it. Longshenpa was quiet for a moment. The sound of the wind against the stone wall of the hermitage was constant. Outside the window, the peaks stood in their afternoon illumination. Everything you have been calling clarity, he said, is a cloud. Clear cloud, stable cloud, luminous cloud, still cloud. Everything that interrupts the clarity is also cloud. Dark cloud, turbulent cloud. The thought that arises mid-meditation cloud. The sensation in the back cloud. The judgment that the sensation in the back has interrupted your practice cloud. He paused. You have been trying to maintain clear cloud and resist dark cloud. And this is why you are tired. Palmo sat with this. The tiredness he named was real. She had not quite framed it that way before. But now that he had named it, she recognized it in her body. The exhaustion of someone who has been guarding something continuously, watching the sky with enormous vigilance, leaping to smooth the clouds when they appear, mourning when they resist smoothing. 11 years of this. The weariness of it was considerable. What you are, Longchenpa said, is not the cloud, not the clear state, not the disrupted state, not the thought, not the stillness between thoughts. You are the sky in which all of it appears. This is what Rigpa means. This is what the great perfection has always been pointing at. Not a special state that arrives after sufficient practice, not a clarity you produce by doing the right things and maintaining the right conditions. It is what you already are. It has always been what you are. Every moment of practice, every moment of clarity, every moment of disruption, all of it happening in the sky of what you are, none of it touching the sky, none of it being the sky. He was quiet again. The wind, the peaks, the very long silence of a high mountain afternoon. The practice, he said, is not to become the sky. You are already the sky. The practice is to stop mistaking yourself for the weather. What happened in Palmo over the hours that followed this exchange was not a sudden transformation, or rather, it was not only a sudden transformation. There was a moment in that small, cold room, perhaps 20 minutes after Longchenpa had spoken, when something in her understanding shifted in a way that was genuine and verifiable and not producible by intention or effort. A moment of recognition, like remembering something you had known your whole life but had misplaced. That the awareness in which all her experience had always appeared was not something she had ever been separate from, was not something she had ever lost in the disruptions, was not something she needed to produce or protect or maintain. It had been there at the bottom of every moment of her life, in the clarity and in the disruption, in the deep stillness of her best meditation sessions and in the contracted anxiety of her worst ones, in the loss of her mother when she was 16, and in the first overwhelming encounter with a text that made her feel understood. There, always, present, unruptured, unreachable by weather. She did not weep. She sat quietly for a long time while the afternoon shifted around her, and at some point, Longchenpa, who had been sitting in his own practice nearby, looked over at her and offered nothing, no evaluation, no congratulation, no confirmation, simply looked at her in the way you look at a sky that has just cleared after rain, noticing the clearing without claiming it, without being surprised by it, because the sky clearing after rain is what sky does, and there is nothing particularly remarkable about a thing doing what it is. She stayed at Gangri Thoka for 2 years. In that time, she studied Longchenpa's writings, the Great Seven Treasuries, the trilogy of finding rest with a different quality of understanding than she had brought to texts before. Not understanding from outside the text, looking in, understanding from inside the space the text was pointing at, looking out. There is a difference between these two modes of relationship to wisdom that is exactly as significant as the difference between reading a description of the sky and looking up. This is the teaching at the heart of the Dzogchen tradition, and at the heart of every tradition that has arrived at its own version of this recognition. You are not your thoughts. You are not your moods. You are not the story your mind is telling about who you are, the story of the person who is doing well, doing badly, succeeding, failing, lovet, lonely, clear, confused. These are all clouds. Some of them are beautiful clouds. Some of them are difficult clouds. All of them are clouds. And you are the sky that holds them, that has always held them, that is not touched by any of them, that is not constituted by any of them, that does not need any of them to be different in order to be what it is. Spaciousness. This is the word Longchenpa used, spaciousness, and it was not a metaphor. It was a description. The space in which your experience appears not the experience, but the space, the awareness that is present right now, as you rest here, that is aware of the darkness around you, aware of the breath moving in and out, aware of whatever thoughts are arising and passing. That awareness is not made of the thoughts. It is not diminished by the difficult thoughts or increased by the pleasant ones. It is simply there, as it has always been, the sky in which everything appears and through which everything passes. The thought that you are tired cloud, the thought that this is hard cloud, the thought that you don't understand this cloud, the thought that you do understand this also cloud, the anxiety about tomorrow and the review of today and the persistent background commentary that the mind generates about its own performance, all cloud, all moving through the sky that you are, none of it touching you, none of it being you. Feel what is present in this moment that is not a thought, not the content of awareness, the awareness itself. The simple fact that you are here, noticing, not the noticing of any particular thing, the noticing itself, that is present when you are confused and when you are clear. It is present during the difficult thought and during the peaceful breath. It is the same thing that is present as you lie in the dark of this night, aware of the silence, aware of the body breathing, aware of the awareness being aware. This is Rigpa. This is the vast sky. This is what you have always been and what you have never not been. You are not the weather. You have never been the weather. The weather has been moving through you your whole life, and through all of it, unchanged, the sky. Let the breath come naturally. Let the thoughts arise and pass as clouds arise and pass, not by forcing them to move, not by gripping them when they are pleasant, not by pushing them away when they are not, simply letting the sky be the sky, which it already is and has always been, and which requires nothing from you in order to be what it is. Feel the weight of your body resting in this. The body is cloud, too warm, present, temporary, precious cloud, moving through the sky of what you are, held in the vast space that has room for all of it and is disturbed by none of it. Feel your shoulders soften into that space. Feel the breath moving freely through it. If sleep comes, let it come through the same sky. If thoughts come, let them come through the same sky. Nothing closes the sky. Nothing has ever closed the sky. You are the vast expanse. You have always been the vast expanse. Rest in this tonight, as Pamo rested in the cold, small room at the top of the world. recognizing something that had been present beneath every moment of her searching, that the one who searched and the space of the searching were not two different things, and that the finding was simply the moment of recognizing what had never been lost. And as the vast sky opens around us, as the breath moves through the space that cannot be disturbed, as the mountain hermitage grows quiet in the dark, we travel now to one final resting place. In a valley below the snowline, where a monk sits beside still water in the last hour before dawn, and lets everything dissolve into the simplest thing that has ever been, or ever needed to be, offered. There is a particular quality of darkness that exists only in the hour before dawn, in the deep forest of northeastern Thailand. It is not the darkness of closed eyes, or the darkness of a room. It is the darkness of a world that is fully present and fully visible, and simply not lit, a darkness with texture, with sound, with smell, with the constant subtle movement of living things that have no need of light to continue being what they are. The frogs near the water's edge do not stop simply because it is dark. The insects that fill the canopy with their long, continuous sound do not stop. The water in the small pond at the edge of the forest monastery does not stop moving, its surface shifting in micro-patterns that have no name, responsive to the air above it and the faint breath of something underground beneath it, continuously in the process of being slightly different from what it was a moment before. The monastery was called Wat Pa, the forest monastery, and it sat in a cleared section of the forest near a village whose name need not concern us. The forest surrounding it was the kind of forest that the Thai forest monks specifically sought out, dense enough to require full attention from anything moving through it, alive with the particular population of creatures that live in close proximity to water in tropical heat, and quiet in the way that only places full of sound can be quiet. The insects and frogs providing a background continuous enough to become something like silence. A sonic ground against which other sounds, a branch falling, a monk coughing somewhere across the compound, arrived with unusual clarity and significance. The old monk, who came to sit by the pond each night in the hour before dawn, had been practicing in this manner for more than 40 years. His name was something names are given at ordination, and sometimes forgotten by those who carry them for long enough, but what his fellow monks called him was simply Luang Po, Venerable Father. And this is the name that matters here. The name that describes his relationship to the people around him, rather than his relationship to the government records of the province in which he had been born. He was past 70. His face carried the specific topography of a life lived mostly outdoors in tropical climate, deeply lined, brown as teak bar. The lines moving in different directions depending on which emotion they had been carved by, which was, in his case, more often than not, the emotion of calm interest in whatever was directly in front of him. He wore his robes as forest monks wear them without ceremony, without the particular adjustment of cloth that in city monasteries signals an ongoing management of appearance. The robe simply covered him. This was its function, and this was enough. He had come to the pond again tonight, as he came every night when his body permitted it, which was most nights. He had walked the 30 steps from his small kuti, the individual dwelling where forest monks sleep and practice along the path that was worn into the earth by this same nightly passage, in the dark that his feet knew without requiring light, to the flat stone at the water's edge that had been worn smooth by his sitting. He had arranged himself on the stone in the manner of his sitting crossed legs, straight spine, hands in the lap, the same arrangement for 40 years, the body knowing this posture the way a riverbed knows the shape of its water, having been shaped by it so long that the shaping has become structural. He sat. The pond was before him. The darkness was around him. The forest sounds were everywhere. He was not practicing in the sense of doing something particular with his mind. He was not reciting a formula, not constructing a visualization, not applying effort toward any specific object of attention. He was simply sitting in the way that a tree stands present in the location, continuous in the posture, connected through the sitting place to the ground beneath it, and otherwise involved in nothing beyond being what it is. This is the practice that the forest tradition called simply being with what is not a technique, not a stage, not an achievement, the ground of all the other practices, the thing that practice is, when all the doing falls away and what remains is simply the presence in which the doing happened. The water moved. He watched it. Or rather, and this is a distinction that mattered to him, though he had stopped being able to say clearly why he was aware of the water moving. There is a small but significant difference between watching something and being aware of it. Watching involves a watcher, and a watcher is something separate from what is watched, positioned at a remove, directing attention from one place to another. Awareness is something less directional. It is present without being aimed. The water moved, and the awareness in which this movement appeared was not aimed at the water any more than the night air was aimed at the frogs it surrounded. It was simply the medium in which the movement occurred. He had been sitting this way for perhaps 2 hours when the first change became apparent, a change so gradual it had no beginning that could be identified. Only a later recognition that something had already shifted. The darkness was different. Not lighter, not yet. The sun was still some time away, but different, in the way that a tide changes the quality of air at the coast long before the water arrives. A faint shift in the character of the dark. Something from the direction of the east that was not yet color, but was in the process of becoming the precondition for color. The frogs had changed too. Not stopped, the sound was continuous, but the composition of it had shifted. The lowest, slowest calls had diminished slightly, and something higher had increased. This happened every morning at a specific time that had no name on any clock, but that the pond knew precisely, and that after 40 years, his body knew as well, registering it as a change in what might be called the quality of the dark rather than anything visible or audible that could be pointed to individually. He breathed. The breath moved through him the way the sound moved through the forest, present, continuous, not located in any particular part of the body more than another, simply the breath being what breath is. A frog landed on the surface of the pond. The concentric rings moved outward from the entry point in the perfect geometry of water, doing what water does with the energy given to it, spreading it evenly outward, diminishing as it spread, reaching the edge of the pond and returning slightly, and then dissolving back into the stillness from which it had come. The whole process took perhaps 4 seconds. The old monk watched it, was aware of it without thought about it, without the commentary that the mind adds to experience when it is in the mode of understanding rather than receiving. Simply the rings, simply the spreading and the returning and the dissolving. This is the teaching that the pond had been giving him for 40 years, not the teaching about rings and ripples as an illustration of impermanence. He had understood impermanence for decades, had understood it as a doctrine, had understood it as a lived experience, had passed through the stage where it was an insight and into the stage where it was simply the description of what he saw every moment he looked at anything. The teaching the pond gave him now was something beyond doctrine. It was something that could only be received in a body sitting still in the dark beside water before dawn, not trying to receive anything. The teaching was the receiving itself. The teaching was the fact of being present, when the frog entered the water, and the rings moved, and the rings dissolved. The teaching had no content. It was simply what happened, available, and he was there and did not miss it. He was aware, after a time, of his hands in his lap. The hands were warm from their own internal warmth, warm from the robe folded over them, warm from the warmth of the body that had been sitting for 2 hours. He was aware of the weight of his legs. He was aware of the particular quality of the stone beneath him, hard, cool, where his robe was not between it and the stone, slightly uneven in a way that he no longer registered as discomfort, because the unevenness had become simply the specific character of this sitting place. As familiar as his own face, he was aware, more distantly, of the sleeping monastery behind him, the small kutis in their separate clearings, the monks inside them in various stages of sleep or wakefulness, or the particular state between the two that long practitioners sometimes inhabit, where the body is still and the awareness is not quite sleeping, but not quite the walking consciousness either. He was aware, even more distantly, of the village beyond the monastery's edge, where people who had given food to the monks yesterday were now in their own sleep, in their own darkness, carrying in their sleeping bodies the same ordinary preciousness of a breathing human being that the monks carried in their waking ones. He was aware, at some distance that was not spatial, of everyone sleeping at this hour, the enormous quiet population of the sleeping world. Millions of people lying in beds and mats and hammocks across the land, and everywhere the same breath moving in and out, and everywhere the same darkness, and everywhere the same moment in which something rested, he thought, or perhaps the thought simply appeared, which is not the same thing. The thought appearing without a thinker arriving first, that this was always the most honest hour. The sleeping world does not perform. The sleeping world does not maintain. It simply is what it is, reduced by sleep to its essential quality. A breathing body in a dark, held by whatever surface offered itself, not doing anything, not going anywhere, simply continuing in the way that all living things continue when the effort of the day has been set down, and what remains is the bare fact of being alive. He thought of the villagers who had put food in his bowl that morning, an older woman who had offered rice with both hands and a deep bow, her face expressing the particular quality of generosity that comes not from having much to give, but from giving what is available with fullness rather than reservation. A child who had watched the monks from behind a gate post, not shy exactly, but not yet accustomed to the sight of so many saffron robes, the child's face open and curious and entirely present in the moment of watching the way children are present before they learn to manage their presence. A man who had given mangoes, still warm from the tree, pressing them into the waiting hands with the briskness of someone used to expressing care through action rather than words. The mangoes themselves still faintly fragrant in the way of fruit that has not traveled far from the tree that grew it. These people slept now. He was aware of them sleeping, not their faces exactly, not the specific texture of their individual dreams, but the fact of them breathing in the same dark, held by the same earth, sharing this hour in the way that all breathing things share the hours of night, whether they know it or not. The forest monks slept. The villagers slept. The city beyond the forest slept. The children and the old ones and the newly grieving and the quietly content slept. Everywhere the breath, everywhere the dark, everywhere the same hour in which whatever was effortful in the day had been, at least temporarily, set down. He breathed. The pond was still now. The frog's rings had long dissolved. The surface was as close to perfect stillness as moving water ever achieves, which is not perfect stillness, but something that in low light and in the particular quality of pre-dawn attention can be received as stillness, can be met with the same quality of rest that one meets actual stillness with. The surface of the pond and the surface of the mind arriving at the same temperature through long shared presence. He became aware gradually, without marking the transition, that the distinction between him and the pond was less clear than it had been when he arrived. This was not mysticism. It was simple. The boundary between a thing and its surroundings has never been as precise as the mind, in its usual mode, insists on drawing it. The air moved between him and the water without respecting the border. His breath moved out of him and into the air of the forest and became indistinguishable from the forest's own exhalation, the exhalation of 10,000 trees and the water of the pond and the frogs and the insects and everything that breathes. The forest breathing out, the forest breathing in, continuous, enormous, simple. He was part of this. He had always been part of this. The sitting still long enough to notice this was the only thing practice had ever been for. He was not sleepy. He was something more settled than sleep, and something more awake than ordinary wakefulness, a state without a good name in the language of his tradition or any other. A state that simply occurred when a body that had been sitting still long enough had found its way below the layer of doing and was now simply being, in the way that the pond was being, in the way that the forest was being, in the way that the pre-dawn dark was being, fully present, fully available, requiring nothing to be different, not managing anything, not going anywhere, complete. The first color came into the east, so slowly it might not have been color at all. At first, a faint distinction between the darkness above the tree line and the darkness of the tree line itself, a slightly different quality of dark rather than any identifiable shade of light. Then, very gradually, something that might be called grey. Then something that might be called the knowledge that there had once been a color called blue, not the color itself, but the precondition for it. The anticipation the eye makes before the light is sufficient to confirm what it knows is coming. He did not move. The birds had begun, not many, not yet, but the first few, the ones that need only a suggestion of light to begin, their calls cutting into the continuous insect sound with a different quality, a different register, the sound of creatures who sleep and wake rather than creatures that are simply always present. The sleeping world was beginning to stir. Somewhere behind him, a monk coughed softly in his kuti. The sound traveled through the forest air with perfect clarity and arrived without disturbing anything. Not the water, not the insects, not the birds, not the old man on the stone. It was simply a sound in the morning. It was simply the monastery breathing. He breathed too, still, present, not thinking about being present, not managing the quality of his presence, not evaluating whether the sitting had been good or sufficient, or approaching some standard of practice that could be checked against. Simply here, as the pond was here, as the stone was here, as the forest was here, everything present, everything breathing, everything entirely itself, and requiring nothing in addition to be complete. This is what 40 years of sitting beside a pond before dawn produces in a body and a mind. Not transcendence, not the absence of ordinary life, not an escape from the difficulty of being a human being alive in the world. Something simpler and harder to name, the capacity to be simply here, without resistance, without demand, without the persistent, subtle reaching towards some other condition, the capacity that the pond already has, that the forest already has, that the sleeping child in the village already has, that the breathing body has always had, underneath all the reaching and the managing, available at any moment. The reaching stops. The breath comes. The breath goes. The water moves. The water stills. The dark becomes grey, becomes the first pale possibility of light. Everything arising, everything passing, nothing lost, nothing held, nothing required to be other than it is. You are breathing. Right now, as these words dissolve, you are breathing. The body is held. The dark is around you. Somewhere, in a forest, you will never visit. Beside water, you will never see. An old man sat on a stone and breathed in the way you are breathing now. And in the breathing, nothing was missing. Nothing was ever missing. The breath arrives. The breath goes. The darkness holds you without effort or condition. Let the weight of today rest somewhere outside this breath. Let the plans for tomorrow rest somewhere outside this breath. There is only this breath, and the dark around it, and the surface of the water that is perfectly willing to be still. If sleep comes, let it come, as the morning comes gradually, without announcement, without asking permission. Simply, the natural consequence of the body that has stayed long enough in the right conditions. You do not need to cross into sleep. Sleep will find you. The way the light found the pond, the way the frogs found the water, the way the morning finds the sleeping world every single time, without fail, without effort, simply because this is what mornings do. Let the breath deepen now. Let the hands rest. Let the eyes close if they have not already closed. Let the border between waking and not waking become as unclear as the border between the old monk and the pond, between the pond and the forest, between the forest and the dark, between the dark and the first pale light of morning that was already beginning, somewhere far away, to arrive. Everything arising, everything passing, nothing held, nothing missing. The breath, just the breath, just this. The journey you have taken tonight has moved across many centuries and many lands through the dusty courtyards of 9th century China, the cedar-scented mountains of Japan, the high stone passes of Korea, the river valleys of Vietnam, the sacred island of Sri Lanka, the snow caves of Tibet, and the dense forest darkness of Thailand before dawn. 8 lives, 8 moments of meeting, and through all of them, one river. Everything teaches. This is what Zhao Zhou showed by sweeping his stones, what Ryokan discovered in the warmth of the kitchen fire, what Sukchiu found when he stopped rushing past the falling leaf and let it fall, what Min Chao discovered on the icy mountain path carrying water she didn't need to understand, what Nandia learned from a lotus closing without complaint, what Rechungpa received from the sky above Lapchi and carried in his chest ever after, what Palmo recognized in a cold hermitage at the top of the world that she had never been the weather, had never been anything less than the sky, and what the old monk beside the pond knew without knowing it, sitting in the darkness before dawn, as the forest breathed around him, and the water moved, and the water stilled. Not one of these teachings arrived as information. Not one of them was delivered in a lecture or extracted from a text. Each one arrived the way morning arrives, gradually, without announcement, in the body of someone who had stayed present long enough to receive it. This is what your ordinary life has always been doing, teaching you. In every moment, it has been given to you, in the difficulty and the stillness, in the grief and the unexpected warmth, in the faces of the people who have loved you and the faces of those who have not. in the bowl washed clean each morning, and the breath that continues through the night without your supervision. It has all been teaching you. It will continue to teach you. You do not need to take notes. If you have drifted tonight through these stories without following every thread, something still passed between us. Wisdom absorbed in sleep works differently than wisdom pursued in waking. It settles rather than accumulates. It deepens rather than expands. It becomes, over time, simply the quality of how you move through the world. These reflections are offered as companions for rest, not as substitutes for the living teachers and communities that tradition preserves. If any story tonight touched something real in you, the touch belongs to you now. If you have found something here worth carrying, you may like to leave a like or share this offering with someone who might need it. It helps these stories reach others who are searching in the dark for exactly what was always here. May you sleep deeply and wake gently. May every ordinary moment continue to offer you what it has always quietly contained. May the bowl be clean in the morning. May the breath be here. Good night.